The winter had already eaten the color out of the world by the time the ground began to move. It started along the northeastern coastline, where the bite churned gray and violent, and the fishing villages had long since boarded their windows against the season. The tremors came without warning. Not the rolling kind that shook loose roof tiles and sent horses sideways, but something deeper. Something that felt less like the earth shifting and more like the earth objecting. Cracks split the frozen shoreline in long, deliberate lines. The sea pulled back from the rocks in a single convulsive motion. Then the black stones rose. They came up in clusters, jagged and enormous, slick with deep water and threaded with minerals that caught the weak light in ways that made the fishermen watching from the tree line feel deeply, wordlessly wrong. The stones were not granite, not basalt, nothing any quarryman in the nearest holdfast could name. When a young boy from the Flint Cliffs threw a rock at the nearest formation, the sound it made was not the sharp crack of stone on stone, but something duller, heavier, impact absorbed rather than deflected. 3 men went to investigate. Trappers, mostly with an old sailor who had charted every reef and shelf the bite concealed across 40 years of crossings. He had not charted this. What the steward's letter described afterward was brief and specific, and hard to set down boots in the snow that stopped mid-stride. A boat hook snapped clean at the handle, and a line of dark cracks radiating outward from the site, like a signature pressed into the earth. The steward had not seen what made them. He had only seen what remained when it was done, which was very little, and arranged in a way that suggested less a fight than an afterthought. It stepped over what was left of them, the letter said, without looking down. Bran Stark was not watching the coastline when it happened. He was watching everything else. He sat in the dim room off Winterfell's great hall, his hands still in his lap, the fire kept deliberately low beside him. The weirwood network spread beneath the land. Like the roots, it was ancient, branching, carrying impressions the way rivers carry silt. Not cleanly, not completely, but faithfully. Bran moved through it without moving. He saw a coastline cracking. He saw black water retreating from stone that had no name. He saw men walking toward something vast and still. And then he saw them stop. And then he saw nothing from their direction at all. What came after the seeing was harder to name than fear. Fear had a shape, a specific object. This was broader, the sensation of something old arriving and finding the world it woke into beneath its standard. Mira had stopped pretending to sharpen her knife. She was watching him from across the low fire, her jaw set, her posture carrying the particular readiness of someone who had learned that stillness in Bran usually preceded bad news, delivered without enough warning. "Something woke up," Bran said. "From where?" "The northeastern coast." He paused. "It doesn't belong here." "Here meaning Westeros. Here meaning anywhere we have a name for." Mira's hand tightened on the knife handle. Not the reflexive grip of someone reaching for comfort. The deliberate grip of someone measuring what they held against what they'd just heard and finding the gap too wide. How bad? Bran looked at her with eyes that had spent too long seeing things no boy's eyes were built for. "It looked at this world," he said, "and found it wanting." 200 miles northeast, Apocalypse stood at the edge of the collapsed cove and let the wind move across him. He was immense, broader, and taller than anything that walked on 2 legs. In this part of the world, his armor rising from his body in dark, angular formations that were neither entirely metal nor entirely flesh. The distinction between them long since rendered irrelevant. His face carried no expression that the word expression was built to describe. His pale eyes moved across the landscape with the weight of a verdict being formed. The air tasted of rot and pine smoke, and the particular exhaustion of a people who had been enduring rather than living for longer than they knew. villages in the near distance, dogs barking at the dark. The smell of iron and old blood soaked into the ground beneath the snow. He had slept beneath the black water for a very long time. The depth of that sleep did not unsettle him. He had slept before in other places and woken to find different configurations of the same essential failure kingdoms built on the claim that inheritance was strength. That name was power that the soft could purchase safety with enough gold or prayer or ceremony. This place wore the same failure in different clothes. The three men who had approached him, two with hunting blades, one with a boat hook, all of them loud with a fear they had not known how to make useful, had told him what he needed to know before he dealt with them. Iron weapons rough forged, layered wool and hide. The posture of men accustomed to hardship, but unacquainted with anything that made hardship look small. He had not given their deaths much consideration. They were Dutta, not opponents. Now the ground beneath his feet told him something else. A presence pressing down from the far north, vast and cold and utterly indifferent to the distinction between the worthy and the worthless. It consumed without selecting. It ended without judging. Whatever it was, it moved through this land like rot through timber, making no choices, honoring no principle, reducing everything to the same gray silence that he would not permit. Not because he cared for the people in its path. The weak among them deserved no protection. They deserved the pressure that would either break them or reveal something harder underneath. But annihilation without selection was not cleansing. It was erasure. And erasure served nothing. It produced nothing. It was the blunt negation of the only law that had ever held. Apocalypse turned south. He began to walk, and where his boots met the frozen ground, the earth cracked open behind him, in long dark lines, not from the force of impact, but as though the land recognized the passage of something that had judged and condemned it long before it arrived. The letter reached Winterfell before dawn. Jon Snow read it standing in his riding gear, still cold from a patrol cut short by weather that had stopped being merely dangerous and started being deliberate. He read it once, handed it to Davos without a word, and watched the older man's face do what experienced faces did when they encountered something that didn't fit the available categories. "Stones from the sea," Davos said. "That's what he says." 3 men gone. No bodies to speak of. Yes. Davos set the letter on the table. Outside, snow pushed against the shutters in steady, rhythmic waves. Ironborn. Some new. The Ironborn don't leave cracks in the ground when they walk. Jon picked up the letter again, found the line he kept returning to. Stepped over what was left of them without looking down. Pull the coastal garrison back. Send word to the nearest lords nothing moves toward that coastline until we know what we're dealing with. He went to find Bran. The small room was dim, the fire barely alive. Bran sat exactly as he always sat, hands in his lap, gaze directed at nothing in the room. "You already know," Jon said from the doorway. "Yes." "What is it? Nothing from our histories, nothing from the patterns of the dead or the old magic." Bran's voice had the quality it always had, now not flat exactly, but removed as though it traveled some distance before arriving. It woke up. It looked at what was here, and it decided to stay. "Why? To judge." Bran paused. "It believes this world has not yet produced what it should. So it intends to force the question." Jon stood with that for a moment, not processing it, not reaching for a plan, just letting the weight of it settle properly before he moved. Then, "Send ravens south, Dragonstone, King's Landing. Every lord with men enough to matter." He pulled the door closed. The corridor was dark and cold. The kind of cold that had stopped being weather and become atmosphere. Somewhere outside, a raven called once and went silent. It was already moving south. That was the only thing that mattered now. The news arrived at Dragonstone in pieces, the way bad news always did. First the fragment that could be explained away, then the fragment that couldn't, then the silence where the next raven should have been. The first message said the northeastern coast had suffered geological disturbance. Unusual stone formations. 3 missing men probably lost to the sea. The maester who summarized it for Daenerys used the word unusual twice and offered 3 separate natural explanations before he finished speaking. The second message said White Harbor was burning. Daenerys read it standing at the window of the war chamber, the parchment held flat in both hands, the narrow sea gray and restless behind the glass. Tyrion watched her read it. He had learned in the months since Essos to track the quality of her stillness. There was the stillness of consideration and the stillness of decision already made, and the stillness that preceded something large and irreversible. This was the third kind. How many ships were in harbor, she said. Not a question. The Manderley fleet? Supply vessels from the free cities. Grain-salted fish timber. Tyrion kept his voice level. Enough to carry the north through the worst of winter. All of it gone. And the garrison. What survived ran south. He paused. The accounts are not consistent, but survivors agree on 2 points. It came from the coast, and it came alone. Daenerys set the parchment beside the table's spread of charts. White Harbor sat near the top, marked in careful ink. She put 2 fingers on it and said nothing for a moment. Show me the other reports. There were 4 collected through Varys's remaining network, and ravens whose senders were likely no longer alive to send more. Tyrion laid them out and stood back. The survivors disagreed on height sequence sound. They agreed that the harbor wall had come apart from the inside out. They agreed that the supply ships had been dismantled rather than burned. Pulled open was the phrase 2 accounts used independently without apparent coordination. They agreed that crossbow bolt spears and a full volley from the harbor's mounted ballista had produced no visible result. One guardsman's account described the figure turning to look at the crossbowmen and then continuing what it had been doing, as though their weapons registered as weather rather than resistance. Tyrion read that line 3 times. It wasn't random, Daenerys said. No. The harbor, the grain stores, the fleet. Her finger traced the northern supply routes across the table. Not the lord's seats, not the castles, the food. Yes, Tyrion folded his hands. Whatever it is, it struck the right target. The North cannot sustain a campaign without White Harbor. Half the grain feeding Jon's armies moved through that port. If this thing continues south through winter, it is moving south. Jon's raven confirms it. Anim, she picked up the message, the one that had arrived 2 hours before the White Harbor reports, which in retrospect gave it the quality of a warning that had arrived too quietly. He asks us to observe before engaging. He uses the word observe twice. Jon would. Jon is also not wrong. Tyrion moved to the table. We have no intelligence on its origin, its limitations, or whether it can be killed at all. Every account we have comes from people who survived by running. No one has tested it and come away with anything other than fewer men. Daenerys turned from the window. The torchlight caught the planes of her face, the silver fall of her hair, the composure that was not calm, but something harder than calm, the look of a woman who had survived things that would have ended most people, and had drawn the wrong lesson from each survival. And if I wait, she said, while it moves through the north unchallenged, what happens to the belief that I can end it? Tyrion did not answer immediately, which was its own answer. There is a thing in this world that walks through dragon fire and tears apart fleets and turns back bolts like rain," she continued. "And I am sitting on this island with 3 dragons. Every day I do not move is a day that story grows larger without me in it." She shook her head once, a small, sharp motion. "The dragons are not weapons, Tyrion. They are the reason anyone believes I will win. That belief is not separate from my power. It is my power. And right now, it is standing on a floor that is beginning to crack. I understand that. Then you understand why I cannot wait." Tyrion picked up one survivor account and set it back down. He had been in enough rooms with enough powerful people to know what a closed decision looked like, and he was standing in front of one now. The knowledge sat in him like a stone. He was right about the risk. He could not make her see it, and the distance between those 2 facts was going to cost someone a great deal. 3 days, he said anyway. "Give me 3 days to get clearer intelligence. If I cannot tell you something useful in that time, I'll help you plan the engagement myself." 3 days is 3 more cities. 3 days might be the difference between a test of strength and a demonstration that strength has limits. He held her gaze. "If the dragons go north and fail, the story people tell about you becomes considerably worse than the story told by patience." The room was still. The charts between them showed the north in fading ink. White Harbor, a small ruined circle at the end of a coastline that had been a logistics problem 2 days ago, and was now something else entirely. Daenerys looked at it for a long time. "1 day," she said. "I will give you 1 day. If you cannot bring me something I can use." She left the rest suspended where it carried more weight than any ending would have. Tyrion nodded. He did not say that 1 day was not enough. He had learned in too many years serving people who held power that the correct move was sometimes to take what was offered and spend it as wisely as possible, rather than demand what was needed and receive nothing. He took the day. He doubted it would change anything. He took it anyway. Bran's message arrived that evening, no salutation, no formality. The handwriting Jon had once described as like each word is being rationed. White Harbor was not chosen because it was near. It was chosen because it was load-bearing. The North's hunger, the North's winter. It has been reading the land the way a man reads a body before he cuts it, finding which parts matter most. It has not come south toward the seats of power. This is not because it has not noticed them. Tyrion read it twice at the window, then once more with better light. Then he brought it to Daenerys. She read it once, set it down, picked up the sealed orders she had already written. Drogon and Rhaegal prepared for flight before dawn. Viserion to remain at Dragonstone as insurance against whatever came while she was gone. She did not put the order down. "He's telling us it hasn't come for any throne," Tyrion said. "I know what he's telling us. Which means engaging it won't give us a political victory even if we win. Which means it hasn't decided we're worth its attention yet." Her voice was very low. "I intend to make that decision for it." She sealed the order. "Have them ready before the sky lightens." In the Great Hall at King's Landing, Cersei received the White Harbor reports 2 hours after Dragonstone had received them. She read them at the high table with Qyburn at her shoulder, who absorbed the same accounts with the expression he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting rather than merely useful. "Purposeful," he said when she set the last page down. "Not territorial, not hungry. It selected White Harbor for a reason." "The grain," Cersei said. "The grain. The fleet. The supply lines." He paused. "Something that understands how a siege works." Cersei turned her wine cup on the table. She had not touched the wine. Outside King's Landing breathed its low collective breath in the bitter dark. Too many people, not enough fuel, the particular desperation of a city that had been promised a short winter and was beginning to understand it had been lied to. She felt no particular sorrow for White Harbor. The North had never been hers. Its dead were someone else's problem. What interested her was the arithmetic. "The Dragon Queen moves north," she said. "She has to. She has no other choice that keeps her useful." She set the cup aside. "If she fails, every lord who is riding to her banner will be looking for somewhere else to stand. And if she succeeds..." A thin pause. "Then she has spent something. Dragons mend time, credibility. None of those come back whole." Qyburn inclined his head. "Either way," Cersei said, "King's Landing watches from behind its walls and learns." She rose from the table. "And while we watch quietly without announcement, we make certain that whatever happens next, we are not caught without options." Qyburn followed her from the hall without asking what she meant. He never needed to. Daenerys flew north before the horizon had fully separated from the sky. Drogon beneath her, Phasegall to her left, both vast and dark against the pre-dawn gray. Their wing beats deep and steady as a drum she had known long enough to feel in her ribs. Below, the narrow sea gave way to coast to the stripped northern terrain, treeless in stretches, snow-packed and raw. The kind of land that wore its hostility on the surface and made no apology for it. She found Apocalypse on the coastal plain north of the ruined harbor. He was standing in the open. No cover, no elevation, no position that made tactical sense for anything that could be killed from above. He had simply stopped walking and waited as though he had known she was coming long before she had made the decision to come. She brought Drogon lower and felt the familiar sharpening, the noise of the last 2 days falling away, leaving only the distance between her and the target and the certainty that the distance was about to close. She had learned to trust that sharpening. It had carried her through the Dothraki Sea and the cities of Slaver's Bay, and a dozen engagements where everything said retreat, and she had pressed through anyway. She pressed through now. Dracarys. The Drogon's flame hit the plain in a column of orange and black. Rhaegal followed from the left, the two streams crossing into a sustained wall of heat that turned the dawn sky noon bright and converted the snow around the impact zone to instant vapor. She had reduced stone fortifications to rubble with less. She had ended sieges of years in the span of minutes. The heat thinned. Apocalypse walked out of its edge. He moved without hurry. Not the movement of something that had endured the fire, but of something that had registered it, the way a man registers a door, closing in another room. His armor was unchanged. The surface of it shifted faintly as she watched the boundary between metal and whatever lay beneath it adjusting, resettling, as though the heat had prompted some internal reorganization rather than damage. His pale gaze moved up to find her. Then the ground came up. The frozen earth buckled and split and rose in massive columns, 60 feet 80 angled across the approach vectors, with a spacing that forced both dragons sideways simultaneously. Rhaegal banked hard left and clipped the second column with his wing, not a full collision, but enough the wrong angle, the wrong force, and the sound he made was not aggression, but shock. The sound of something large discovering a new category of hurt. He dropped hard before his wings caught again. Daenerys hauled Drogon into a climb and came back around. The second pass was lower and harder. Drogon spending himself fully, the flame sustained for nearly 30 seconds over the same ground. The figure vanished in the blaze. Then it stepped out of the blaze. One arm rose and something happened in the air between them, not visible, not anything her senses had language for. But Drogon felt it before she did, and wrenched sideways with a violence that nearly broke her grip on his back. She held. She leveled him. Rhaegal was losing altitude to her left, his damaged wings shortening each stroke, the bitter air winning the argument. She pulled east. She did not look back at the plane as she flew away from it. Looking back would have required acknowledging what the plane now contained, and what it contained was a verdict. She had come north to demonstrate something. She was returning with a different demonstration entirely, one she had not chosen and could not use. Behind her, the steam from 2 passes of dragonfire flattened on the wind and scattered. The scorched ground stretched 100 yards in every direction from the impact zones. At its center, Apocalypse lowered his arm. He stood there for a moment in the settling silence, not watching her retreat, not marking it as a victory. Simply concluding an assessment. Then he turned and resumed walking south, as though the entire encounter had been a single data point in a much longer calculation, and the calculation was not yet finished. Rhaegal landed at Dragonstone before noon, and everyone on the island who had eyes could see what had happened to his wing. He came in low and wrong, his left side compensating for the damaged limb with a lurching counterweight that turned the final approach into something difficult to watch. He had not cried out. Dragons absorbed injury with a silence that made the damage worse to observe than any sound would have. The handlers who rushed to meet him found the left wing's leading edge torn along a line, suggesting not claws or flame, but compression struck and bent rather than cut the way iron bends under a press, rather than a blade. Daenerys walked past them without stopping. She crossed the stone bridge and the inner gate and went directly to the war chamber, and her stride had the quality of someone keeping a very heavy thing upright through insistence alone. Tyrion followed at a distance close enough to be present and far enough to be invisible. He had served enough powerful people to know the difference between solitude and isolation, and that forcing speech into the first kind of silence converted it into the second. He gave her an hour. When he entered, she was at the embrasure, still in her riding clothes, her hair wind-stripped from its arrangement and hanging loose. The narrow sea below was the color of hammered lead. "The wing can heal," he said. Not because it was the most pressing thing, but because it was true, and starting from true ground occasionally opened doors. "I know." Rhaegal is young, 6 weeks, perhaps 8. "I know Tyrion." He let that settle. Below, he could hear handlers working low voices, the soft, heavy sound of a dragon finding its rest on stone. "The lords who received ravens this morning already know about White Harbor," he said. "They will know about today before the sky goes dark. What matters now is what they hear, and from whom, and in what sequence." Daenerys turned from the embrasure. Her face had the precise blankness of someone who had decided blankness was the only expression she could afford. "Tell me what they'll say." The defensible version, the Queen moved fast, engaged an unknown threat, withdrew to reassess. "Decisive, if unresolved." He paused. "The other version, the dragons are not enough. The other version travels faster. And the truth?" Tyrion considered for a moment. "The truth is that it walked through Dragonfire twice, and the engagement ended worse for us than for it. The truth is less valuable than the defensible version right now, so we work with the defensible version until we have something that replaces it." He moved toward the spread of charts on the table. "What we need is a story that keeps the lords from calculating their own survival separately from ours. If they scatter, we lose the ability to concentrate force. Lose that, and everything else follows in order." Daenerys looked at the charts, the same ones from the night before, supply routes traced in the same ink, White Harbor still marked in its small ruined circle. She had not touched them. "Jon Snow sent a raven this morning," Tyrion said. "Before we left. She did not reach for it." "What does it say?" "He wants to meet." Not Dragonstone, not Winterfell. Somewhere between somewhere that can be defended. Tyrion unfolded the letter. He argues we stop treating this as a problem belonging to whoever it happens to be standing nearest to and start treating it as everyone's problem at the same moment. His phrasing is rather more direct. What is his phrasing? Tyrion glanced down. If we keep waiting for it to reach our doorstep before we respond, it will reach our doorstep and we will be alone when it does. Daenerys was silent for a moment. Then, he's right. He usually is about the large things, less so about the political dimensions. Tyrion set the letter on the surface between them. But the large things are what count here. She turned back to the embrasure. The tension in the room had shifted less brittle now, more like the stillness of someone absorbing a weight they had decided to carry rather than set down. Send word to Jon. Tell him I'll go wherever he names. A beat, and get me something on what we're dealing with. Origin limitation, anything that functions as a weakness. I will not stand at Harrenhal next to Lannister's soldiers with nothing in my hand. Tyrion noted the word Harrenhal and said nothing about it. She had arrived there herself. He had been thinking it since the previous night. I'll start with the Mysters, he said, and what remains of Varys' network. He went to work. The stories reached King's Landing in waves, each one larger and less accurate than the one before. The first said, a sea creature had destroyed White Harbor, vast, armored, risen from deep water, the kind of explanation sailors reached for when losses had no face. The second said it was a man, not a creature impossibly large and impervious to iron, who had emerged from black stones the coast had pushed up from the sea floor. The third said the Dragon Queen had flown north and been turned back. Her beasts wounded her forces still marooned on their island. The third moved fastest. By evening it had grown the dragons were broken. Both dying, the thing from the stones had reached up into the sky and snapped Rhaegal's wing with one hand. In the markets, men who had never been north of the Neck described the encounter with the confidence of survivors. On the steps of a sept near the Street of Steel, a red priest from Essos stood before a crowd that had grown larger than he expected and told them that what moved through the north was neither creature nor man, but a reckoning that the Age of Dragons had always been borrowed against an older debt and the lender had finally arrived to collect. They listened the way frightened people always listen to stories that explained why they should always have known this was coming. Cersei had the accurate version from Qyburn well before the distorted ones completed their first loop through the city. She read it alone, read it a second time, set it down and watched the hearth for a while. Rhaegal damaged, Daenerys in retreat. The thing from the coast, unharmed. She had anticipated the Dragon Queen struggling eventually. She had not anticipated it happening this fast, this visibly with this little room for interpretation. There was a distance between an opponent being weakened in the field and an opponent being publicly shown as insufficient. Daenerys had crossed from the first to the second in a single morning, over a coastline most of King's Landing could not place on a map. Cersei turned that over the way she turned all advantages, slowly looking for the angle at which it became most worth spending. Jaime entered without knocking. He had the look he carried when something had forced him to revise his sense of how bad things stood. Jaw tight, the recalibration visible in the way he held himself. Sword arm slightly forward without his awareness. "You've heard," she said, "from 3 sources. They agree on nothing except the center of it." He stopped in the middle of the room. "Cersei. 2 dragons and it didn't go down. I know. That's not something we can maneuver around. That's not a rival we wait out. That's..." He stopped himself. The firelight moved along his face. Whatever this is, it isn't playing by the rules we know. Cersei rose and moved to where the wine sat untouched, pouring a cup she had no intention of drinking. The motion was cover. It gave her hands occupation while she arranged her thinking. Daenerys will reach for alliance, she said. She has no other ground to stand on now. She'll need Jon's armies, and Jon will need our steel if he wants to make any serious argument about combining force, which means a raven will arrive here proposing cooperation. And we respond as expected. She set the cup down. We send men to Harrenhal. It's the only convergence point with the geography and the symbolic weight to make Daenerys feel she isn't walking into our house. Her voice carried the unhurried level of someone reporting a conclusion already reached rather than reasoning toward one. And while the Alliance assembles at Harrenhal Qyburn, we'll ensure the castle holds certain preparations that the Alliance does not know about. Jaime's expression shifted into something that didn't resolve. What kind of preparations? The kind that mean if the collective effort fails, if it walks through all of them, King's Landing isn't holding a broken hand. She met his eyes. We are not the North. We carry no obligation to die proving a point. He stood with that for a long moment. The fire moved. The tension in his sword hand was there again, faint and unconscious, the reflex of a man whose body had not entirely accepted what his mind was being asked to accept. Then, and if they win, if it ends at Harrenhal, then we sent men and shared in the victory. She lifted the cup she still wasn't going to drink. We are positioned well regardless. That is the entire purpose of positioning well. Jaime left without answering. Not the exit of a man who agreed she knew what agreement looked like in him. And this wasn't it. This was a man who had seen the shape of something and was measuring it against a part of himself that years of surviving her hadn't fully ground away. She watched the hearth and thought about Harrenhal. Its walls already scorched once by dragonfire that belonged to a different age. Its abandoned halls and collapsed cellars and the deep spaces beneath the oldest foundations where no one would think to look if someone moved early and quietly enough. She sent for Qyburn. 3 days after the coastal engagement, Bran sent word to every location still receiving ravens. It said the encounter with the dragons did not slow it. It gathered from that engagement the range of dragonfire, the flight behavior under pressure, and the distance between what a rider can sustain and what a dragon can. It is carrying this forward. It moves toward the middle of the continent, not for any symbolic reason, because it has determined that the middle is where all of you will eventually be forced to gather. It knew that before any of you did. Jon read the message in the dim room at Winterfell, then looked at the candle until it had burned a half-inch shorter. He had grown up in a world where the worst threat was a thing that wanted to destroy you, and the answer was to stand between it and everyone else and hold. He had held repeatedly at costs that had accumulated into a weight he carried without discussing. The principle had worked. This was different in a way that resisted clean description, less a new threat than the discovery that the ground he'd always stood on had been thinner than he knew. Out there was something that had no interest in his death as an end in itself. It wanted to measure him, to press until he broke or proved he wouldn't. And that distinction he was finding carried a particular kind of dread that wanting to kill you did not. He wrote 2 letters. The first to Daenerys, wherever you name, I'll be there. The second to the remaining northern lords, 3 sentences. Whatever you think of the South, whatever debts you're owed by any house or any name, set it aside, not forever, long enough to matter. He sealed both and left them for the Maester. Outside, the wind had found its winter edge, the kind that settled in and stayed. Across the continent, ravens were carrying the same fear in different directions, and the fear was accumulating ragged human full of the contradictions that made people difficult and worth protecting, into something aimed without intention toward a ruined castle that had been burned before and was being prepared by people who did not know they were doing it to burn again. Harrenhal. The name carried its history before anyone invoked it. It always had. The column from Dragonstone reached the Riverlands on the fourth day, moving north through country that had not yet heard the full story, but had felt the edges of villages where the inn fires burned lower than usual, and the locals watched the road with the eyes of people waiting for confirmation of something they already believed. Tyrion rode near the front, which was not where he preferred to be. He preferred positions with more than one exit. But the position at the front at least gave him the road ahead, rather than the backs of other men's horses, and right now, the road ahead was the thing worth watching. It ran through brown, stripped country toward a sky that couldn't decide between gray and the darker gray that preceded snow. And somewhere up that road was Harrenhal, and somewhere beyond Harrenhal, or possibly before it, the intelligence was still fragmentary, was the thing they were all pretending they had a plan to stop. He pulled his horse back to ride alongside Daenerys, who had been at the head of the column for 3 hours and had not invited conversation with anyone. "The Stark forces should reach Harrenhal 2 days after us," he said, matching her pace. "Jon estimates 5,000 swords. Less than we hoped, more than the Northern Lords were inclined to give. And the Lannisters? Cersei has committed 3,000 men under the command of, and I recognize the irony, Sir Gregor Clegane's replacement, a man whose main qualification appears to be that he frightens his own side as much as the enemy." He paused. "She also committed her presence, which she defined as writing a letter of endorsement and remaining in King's Landing." Daenerys' expression said several things without settling on one. She's sending men, but not coming herself. She's sending men while retaining the ability to claim credit if we win and distance if we don't. He let that stand on its own for a moment. "It is objectively the correct political move. I find it objectionable precisely because it's correct." She rode in silence for a while. The road curved through a collapsed hamlet, 2 walls standing, a third caved inward, a scorched roof beam jutting up from the snow like a broken mast. No recent damage. This was older from the war that had ground through the Riverlands seasons ago. The country had been healing badly the way wounds healed badly when they were not allowed to close. "She'll have Qyburn doing something at Harrenhal before we arrive," Daenerys said. It was not phrased as a question. Tyrion found when he checked his own certainty against hers that they had arrived at the same place from different directions. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. "I don't know what form it takes." Does Jaime know? Jaime suspects. He won't say it in those words yet, but he's been asking the wrong questions about Harrenhal's lower levels, which means he's been thinking the right ones. Tyrion shifted in the saddle. "I'd rather have him actively looking than passively wondering." "Then tell him to look." "I intend to." He watched the road ahead. "The difficulty is that if we look too openly, Cersei's men notice us looking, and whatever's hidden gets moved before we find it. We need Jaime to be quiet about it." Daenerys glanced at him sideways. Can he be quiet about it? Tyrion thought of his brother, the particular mixture of recklessness and precision that made Jaime Lannister genuinely dangerous as an asset and occasionally dangerous as an ally. "When it matters, to Medway?" "Nars," he said. "He can." Harrenhal announced itself from 3 miles out. Not with walls or towers, though the towers were visible eventually, enormous. Their tops melted and collapsed inward by dragonfire 4 centuries old. The stone fused into shapes that had no architectural precedent and gave the upper sections the look of something that had screamed once and frozen mid-sound. What announced it first was scale. The castle was simply too large for its surroundings. A structure built for a world that had expected to be grander than it became, squatting over the riverlands like a weight placed on the wrong part of a scale. Tyrion had been here before under worse circumstances. The place had not improved. The gates were open. They had been open since the war. The mechanisms that controlled them either broken or simply abandoned the iron. So massive it would have taken 50 men to move them without the machinery. And the machinery was gone. The column filed through in segments, horses and men and supply wagons, and the smaller carts carrying the wounded from the previous week's skirmish near the God's Eye, where a scouting force had encountered something they could not adequately describe and had retreated minus 11 men and all of their composure. Jon Snow arrived before the last of the Dragonstone forces had finished setting up camp in the outer ward. He came with Davos and a small escort, which was either a gesture of trust or a failure of caution, and Tyrion suspected it was the former, made to look like neither. Jon looked the way he had looked at every difficult juncture Tyrion had observed him, at steady, dark-eyed, carrying the kind of tiredness that had stopped being something he noticed and become instead the background condition of his existence. He dismounted without ceremony and found Tyrion before he found anyone else. "How many dead at the God's Eye?" he said. "Not hello." 11 confirmed. 3 more unaccounted for. Tyrion shook his hand briefly. They described something consistent with the accounts from the coast, but closer. It was passing through, not engaging. It left them when they retreated. "It left them," Jon repeated, with a flat emphasis of someone filing the detail in a specific location. It was moving south. They were in its way. When they stopped being in its way, it lost interest. So, Tyrion watched his face. "That's either reassuring or the most alarming thing I've heard this week, and I've had a competitive week." "It's alarming," Jon said. "It means it has priorities. It's not hunting. It's going somewhere. Here, presumably. Here." They stood with that for a moment. The cold working through the gaps in Tyrion's traveling cloak, the sounds of a military camp assembling itself around them, orders, horse complaints, the rhythmic percussion of tent stakes being driven into ground that had not fully unfrozen. "Where's the Queen?" Jon said. "Reviewing the Eastern Ward with her advisors. She'll want to speak to you before the full council." Tyrion paused. "I'd recommend letting her set the terms of the first conversation. She came here with something to prove, and nothing to prove it with yet. That particular combination is delicate." Jon looked at him with an expression that suggested he had already understood this and was slightly impatient at having it explained. "I know how to talk to her, Tyrion." "You know how to talk to people honestly. That's not always the same thing." The council gathered in Harrenhal's great hall as the light failed, which meant they gathered under torchlight that threw more shadow than illumination and made the ruined ceiling above them feel closer than it was. The hall had once held 1,000 men. It now held 40, and the acoustics of it made 40 sound like a rumor. Daenerys sat at the head of the scarred oak table that someone had dragged to the center of the hall. Probably the same someone who had ordered the torches, attempting to impose the furniture of authority on a space that swallowed it. She wore gray and dark red nothing Targaryen ceremonial, which Tyrion noted as a decision. She had chosen to arrive as a commander rather than a queen, which was the right call given the room and the circumstances, and the fact that it was the right call would not make it any less difficult to maintain for the length of what was coming. Jon sat across from her. Jaime sat to the side, slightly back from the table's edge, in the posture of a man who had decided to observe before committing to a position. The northern commanders occupied one end. The Lannister officers, good soldiers. Tyrion thought loyal to the pay, rather than the politics, occupied the other. Everyone in the room understood that everyone else in the room would rather be somewhere else. We have perhaps 3 days before it reaches striking distance of this position. Daenerys opened. Less if its pace has increased. The question before this council is not whether to engage. That decision has been made. The question is how to make the engagement cost it something. Jon leaned forward. What do we know about what costs it something? Very little, Tyrion said from his position standing to one side. The dragons slowed it for approximately no time at all. Conventional weapons have accomplished nothing in any documented encounter. The only accounts we have of it appearing to pause or redirect are when it encounters something it finds worth assessing. It assesses, Jon said. Then it acts. Based on available evidence, yes. So, if we can keep it assessing, keep changing what it thinks it understands about us, we extend the time before it acts decisively. Daenerys looked at him across the table. You're describing a strategy of prolonged engagement with something that cannot be hurt. I'm describing the only thing that isn't stand in a line and wait to be killed, Jon said. The room was silent. He continued more evenly. Rhaegal is healing. Viserion is at full strength. If we can force it into a sustained engagement rather than a single overwhelming exchange, the dragons become more useful. We use the terrain. We use the numbers to create angles it has to respond to simultaneously. He looked around the table. It's not a plan for winning. It's a plan for not losing immediately, which right now is the first problem. The Lannister commanders said nothing, which was either professional deference or private calculation about whether this table represented an investment worth protecting. Tyrion suspected the latter. Jaime spoke for the first time. The castle's eastern cellars, he said. He was looking at the table rather than at anyone specifically. I'd want to know what's in them before we're fighting above them. A small silence. Tyrion kept his face neutral. Several people looked at Jaime with the polite confusion of people who couldn't tell if the comment was tactical or something else. I'll have them checked, Jon said after a beat that was one beat too long. He looked at Tyrion. Tyrion looked at the candle nearest him. Tonight. Jaime nodded once and went back to the posture of a man observing. The council continued for another hour. Formations were discussed. Supply lines were drawn and argued over. A northern commander and a Lannister officer had a disagreement about positioning the cavalry reserves that stopped just short of needing physical intervention. Daenerys adjudicated it with the flat efficiency of someone who had stopped having the patience for pride that served no tactical function, and both men accepted the outcome with the resentful compliance of people who had run out of energy to sustain the alternative. By the time the hall began to empty, the plan they had assembled was functional in the way that plans assembled under pressure from incompatible parts were functional, plausible in structure, fragile in execution, dependent on cooperation between people who would stop cooperating the moment circumstances changed in ways that made individual survival more compelling than collective action. Tyrion watched them file out and remained at the table after the others had gone. That same night in the cellars below Harrenhal's oldest eastern tower, Qyburn's people finished their work. They had been arriving for 6 days, not as soldiers, not as servants, but as stonemasons, contracted for structural assessment, craftsmen hired to evaluate the castle's foundations ahead of occupation. The documentation was legitimate. The contracts were real. What the contracts did not specify was that the structural assessment included the placement of sealed iron containers in specific locations in the lower vaults, spaced and angled in ways that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with thermodynamics. The substance in the containers was not described in the contracts either. The men who placed them knew what it was. They worked in the specific silence of people who had been very clearly told what would happen if they worked in any other way. When they were done, they climbed back through the access shafts and sealed the stone behind them. And by morning they had left the castle entirely dispersed into the Riverlands countryside, by routes that ensured they would not be found easily by anyone who went looking. In the walls above, the lowest vault in a hairline crack that a mason's hammer could have closed in 30 seconds, a single faint line of green was visible. If you pressed a torch to the stone and knew what you were looking at, nobody pressed a torch to that stone. Bran's final message before the engagement reached Harrenhal just before dawn. Jon read it in the dim of the outer ward, standing alone with a torch against the pre-dawn dark. It said, "It knows where you are." It knew before the council finished meeting. It is not coming because you gathered, because it was already coming here. This was its destination. You were the ones who needed to catch up. It will arrive at dawn on the third day. Jon stood with the message until the torch began to gutter. Around him, the camp breathed in its collective fitful sleep. 20,000 men and women arranged in their formations, their weapons stacked, and their fires banked, and their plans made, and their plans wrong in ways none of them yet understood. He folded the letter, looked at the massive dark shape of Harrenhal above him, towers melted by ancient firewalls that had absorbed centuries of violence, and stood anyway through sheer accumulated mass, a castle that had swallowed every king who'd claimed it and given none of them what they came for. 3 days. He went to find Daenerys. The dawn came in wrong. Not dark, the sky to the east showed its usual gray progression toward light, but the quality of the air had changed overnight. A pressure difference that had nothing to do with weather and that the horses understood before the men did. By the time the first watch came off duty, the animals in the eastern yard were restless in their lines, pulling against their ties, and the dogs that had followed the column from the Riverlands were gone, not scattered, gone collectively between 1 hour and the next without sound. Jaime stood on the eastern wall and watched the road. The wall was cold under his hands, stone that had been hot once fused at the top by dragon fire so old it was history rather than memory, and had never quite lost the particular density of rock that had been through something it wasn't built for. He had been on this wall since the 3rd hour of the morning, unable to sleep, unwilling to examine why. Below him, the camp was stirring into its pre-battle routine fires. Relit weapons, checked men eating what might be the last meal they would have time for. The sounds of it were familiar. The sounds of 20,000 people preparing to stand between one thing and another. He had heard those sounds from both sides over the years and recognized them the way you recognized a language you had grown up in. What he did not recognize was the absence at the edge of it. The silence just beyond the road, where the sound of birds should have been. Tyrion appeared at his shoulder, without announcing himself, which was a habit Jaime had long since stopped finding surprising. He was carrying 2 cups that steamed in the raw air, and he handed one over without comment. "You've been up here a while," Tyrion said. "The birds are gone." Tyrion looked at the tree line. He was silent for a moment. "I noticed the dogs." "Same instinct." Tyrion wrapped both hands around his cup. "The cellars," he said. "The eastern ones. I had them checked last night." Jaime looked at him. The access shafts were resealed with new mortar. Tyrion kept his voice level, the voice he used when the information was bad, and he was managing the speed at which it arrived. "Recent. Days, not weeks. I had a man pull one open. He came back up quickly and would not describe what he smelled." The wall was quiet between them for a moment. Below, the camp moved in its patterns. Commanders calling formations, lines of infantry taking their positions along the outer approaches. The cavalry reserves shifting into the eastern yard exactly as the plan specified. The plan. "How much?" Jaime said. "Unknown. The placement pattern suggests the man who designed it was thinking about coverage rather than concentration. Not one large charge, many smaller ones distributed. Tyrion looked into his cup. Under the eastern hall, beneath the outer wall segments, possibly under the main approach within the gate. Jaime looked at the camp below him, the men in their formations, the banners of the north and the riverlands and the Targaryen dragon, snapping in the pre-dawn wind. 20,000 people who had arrived here on the understanding that they were standing inside the same walls for the same reason. She planned this before she committed the men, he said. Yes. He had known it, since the council known it, the way you knew a tooth was going bad. Before it became pain, the constant low awareness of something wrong at the edge of everything else. And still hearing Tyrion confirm it produced a specific cold that the wind had not. Does Jon know? Not yet. I'm telling you first because you're the one who can move through the Lannister officers without triggering questions. Tyrion set his cup on the wall's edge. We have perhaps 2 hours before whatever is coming is close enough to matter. If we clear the eastern sections now quietly, without announcing why. 2 hours isn't enough to move 20,000 people and their equipment out of positions they've spent 3 days establishing. No, Tyrion agreed. It isn't. Which is why I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting we move the people who are standing directly above the worst of it. He looked up at Jaime directly. And I'm suggesting we tell Jon because whatever happens next, he needs to know what kind of battlefield he's standing in. Jaime set his own cup down, looked at the tree line where the birds weren't, looked at the camp below where 20,000 people were following a plan that had been designed to kill them. He moved toward the stairs. The sound arrived before the sight of him, not a battle cry, not the thunder of an army, a low sustained vibration in the earth itself, the kind that traveled through stone and boot leather and up through the body before it reached the ears as sound. The horses felt it first, and the horses were already fighting their lines. Then the outer scouts came back at a run, and then the outermost scouts didn't come back at all. And then Apocalypse came over the rise to the north of the road, and the scale of him hit the assembled army the way cold water hit the face, not painful yet, but immediately and completely clarifying. He was immense. The morning light caught him wrong too much of him for the available space. The dark angular armor rising from his frame in formations that had no reference in any military tradition that had ever occupied these lands. He moved without urgency, without acceleration, at the pace of something that had decided the distance between itself and its destination was an administrative matter rather than a tactical one. The catapults fired first. 4 in sequence along the northern approach, the heavy stones arcing high and coming down on him in a spread that should have buried a column of cavalry. 3 missed. 1 struck him directly in the chest and shattered. He did not slow. Daenerys brought Drogon over the wall from the south, and Viserion rose from the eastern yard to meet her. Both dragons crossed above the camp at low altitude, massive and black and terrible, in the way that was supposed to end arguments. And their combined shadows swept over the assembled forces below, like a single enormous hand passing over a table of scattered pieces. Dracarys. The flame hit the approach road in a wall of heat that turned the stones beneath it to liquid at the edges and sent steam boiling 50 feet into the air. Viserion added his own column from the east, and for a moment the road between Apocalypse and Harrenhal ceased to exist as a traversable surface. He walked through the steam. The ground ahead of him began to break. It came up in sections, not the single dramatic columns of the coastal engagement, but a systematic dismantling of the terrain, the frozen earth heaving and splitting along the lines of buried stone and old foundation work, as though something beneath the surface was turning the land inside out. The northern approach fractured along its length, a section of the outer wall, 40 feet of it. Ancient stone that had survived 4 centuries of neglect, separated from its foundation and fell outward in pieces, large enough to kill the men stationed below it, and did. The eastern gate twisted in its frame and jammed open at an angle that funneled the cavalry reserve into a bottleneck it had not been designed to occupy. John's voice cut through the noise from somewhere behind the northern line, commands sharp and specific, rotating the infantry to cover the wall breach. Redirecting the cavalry from the bottleneck, the practiced authority of a man who had held lines before in conditions that argued against holding. The line bent, but did not immediately break. The northern soldiers were disciplined, and they were afraid, and afraid disciplined soldiers were the most durable kind. Apocalypse came through the outer gate. What followed was not a battle in the sense that anyone in that field had been trained to understand. A battle had coherent phases: engagement, pressure, retreat, or advance resolution. What happened when Apocalypse entered the outer yard had none of those phases because he made the phases irrelevant. He moved through the formed infantry the way a hand moved through standing water. The formation deforming around him, closing again behind him, men being thrown or crushed or simply displaced in ways that had no reference in any training any of them had received. The shields that touched him bent inward. The weapons that struck him contributed nothing. Jaime was in the middle of it. He had been moving toward the eastern gate when the outer wall came down and the fall of stone had separated him from his escort and deposited him in the outer yard alone with a sword that felt, in the new context, like the wrong tool for an entirely different kind of problem. He kept moving because stopping was worse. He found a knot of northern infantry trying to maintain formation around a gap in the perimeter and pushed into it, adding one more sword to a line that needed 50. Apocalypse turned toward the eastern hall. For a moment, Jaime could see him clearly. The full scale of him, the armor surface that caught the morning light and gave nothing back, the pace that didn't change regardless of what stood in front of it. He moved through the outer yard, and the yard reorganized itself around his passage bodies and debris, and the remnants of positions that had taken 3 days to establish, clearing away from him, the way snow cleared from a hearthstone. He was not angry. That was the thing Jaime found himself understanding, with a completeness that sat in him like a weight dropped from a height. He was not angry, not pleased, not in any emotional register that a man fighting for his life would recognize. He was conducting an assessment. The army around him was data. The resistance was data. The question being answered was a question about the quality of what existed here, and the answer so far appeared to be insufficient. Dragon came low over the eastern hall, and the flame hit the outer yard in a sustained column that lit the combatants and the stone and the air itself. Men who had been fighting retreated from the heat, and for 30 seconds the yard was nothing but fire and the sound of a city being unmade. Then from beneath the eastern hall, the first of the charges went. The sound was different from dragonfire. Dragonfire was enormous and directional. It went where it was pointed, the violence of it coherent and purposeful. This was something else. This came from everywhere, simultaneously, from under the stones, from behind the walls, from the foundations that had been standing for 4 centuries and would not stand past this morning. The initial detonation sent a column of green fire through the eastern hall floor and up through the ceiling in a single vertical explosion that took the hall apart from the inside, and before the debris from that had finished falling. The secondary charges began chain-linked, deliberate in their spacing, running east along the outer wall and south beneath the main approach and west under the cavalry ward. Green, not orange, not red. The specific cold green that everyone in Westeros old enough to remember the Battle of the Blackwater recognized at a register below thought. Tyrion, thrown from his feet by the first detonation, lay in the rubble of what had been the council chamber doorway and looked at the sky through a hole in the wall that had not been there 4 seconds ago. The sky was the wrong color. He had been afraid of this. He had known this was the answer to the question he had not quite finished asking, and the knowing had not helped at all. Around him, people were burning. Not combatants, soldiers who had been standing between the charges, and safety people who had come to Harrenhal carrying weapons against one enemy and were being killed by a different one who was not even present. He could hear Jon's voice still above the roar and the screaming still issuing commands to a formation that no longer existed in the shape the commands assumed. He could hear the dragons somewhere above the smoke. Whether they were still fighting apocalypse or simply trying not to fly through a column of wildfire, he could not tell. He got to his feet, moved toward Jon's voice. In the eastern hall, Apocalypse walked through the wildfire. The green flames licked across his armor and found nothing to hold. He stood in the burning hall for a moment and observed what was happening around him. The army breaking apart, men running in the specific directionless way, a people who had lost the mental architecture of why they were standing. Where they were standing, the castle tearing itself open from inside under the force of charges that had been placed by hands he had not placed there. He turned his head and looked in the direction of King's Landing. He noted that. Then he walked forward out of the eastern hall through the rubble of the outer wall and stood in the open ground beyond Harrenhal, where the morning air was clean of smoke and the road south stretched away in the pale winter light. Behind him, the castle burned in two colors, the orange of wood and thatch, and the cold, hard green of something older and angrier, and what had been the assembled military force of Westeros's remaining factions was scattered across the inner yards, and the approach roads in the configurations of a route, rather than a retreat, because a retreat required a direction, and a direction required a command structure, and the command structure had ceased to function the moment the floor came up. Jon pulled Davos out of a doorway that was about to lose its lintel and found Tyrion 20 yards further on, bleeding from a cut across the forehead and moving with the focused expression of a man operating on a different fuel source than the one he normally used. "How many?" Jon said. "I don't know yet." Tyrion looked back at the burning hall. "Too many. Can we rally? Not here. Not in this. Not in..." Tyrion looked at him directly with the eyes of a man who had just watched a plan he had built be dismantled by a plan he hadn't known about in time. "We move. Now. South and east away from the green. Whoever can follow, follows. We count later." Jon looked at Harrenhal one more time, the towers that had been ruined before, and were now more ruined, the walls coming apart in their sections, the color of the fire that was eating the structure wrong and ancient and unforgiving. Somewhere in the chaos, Daenerys was pulling Drogon out of the smoke. Somewhere Jaime was in the rubble of the outer yard. 20,000 people had come here with a plan, and the plan was gone, and what remained was the oldest version of the problem. Get out, find ground. Recount what you still have. He moved. Apocalypse stood on the road south of Harrenhal until the sounds from the castle had decreased to the low background register of a fire finding its final fuel. He had assessed what the assembled forces of this continent could produce. He had noted the secondary action, the explosive material in the foundations placed by someone who had decided that destroying her own alliance was preferable to allowing it to succeed without her. He found this interesting in the way that evidence of a particular quality of intelligence was always interesting, even when that intelligence was operating at a scale far below his own. The world had not impressed him with its strength, but it had marginally impressed him with its willingness to destroy itself rather than surrender to an external ordering. That was something. It was not enough, but it was something. From the north, far beyond the distance any human eye could perceive, he could feel the slow, cold pressure of the thing that was consuming the lands below the wall. Indiscriminate, unselective grinding, everything beneath the same temperature without distinction. That remained unacceptable. He turned north. The road behind him led to a burning castle and the scattered remnants of a coalition that had believed collectively and incorrectly that numbers and preparation and the old weapons of an old world were adequate instruments for what had arrived among them. They would learn otherwise. The ones who survived would begin the slow process of understanding that survival itself was insufficient, that the standard was not continuation, but quality, not persistence, but worthiness. He would give them the opportunity to demonstrate that. Later. The North first. 3 days out from Harrenhal, the survivors stopped calling themselves an army. It happened without announcement. No order, no ceremony. No moment where someone said we are no longer what we were. Through the gradual cessation of behaviors that no longer made sense. The formations dissolved into columns, the columns dissolved into groups, the groups shuffled forward at whatever rate the wounded could sustain, which was not fast. Tyrion counted roughly 6,000 people crossing the God's Eye Road on the second morning against the 20,000 who had filed into Harrenhal 3 days before. The numbers were estimates. He had stopped asking for precision when the men responsible for keeping counts told him they had lost their tallying sticks in the fire. 6,000. Moving south and east, away from the green smoke that was still impossibly visible on the horizon. A smear in the sky that the wind had not dispersed and that nobody was willing to look at for long. Jon walked rather than rode because his horse had not survived the eastern yard. He had a borrowed cloak, a sword pulled from the rubble, and Davos beside him, which was enough. 2 days on the narrow fuel of necessity. No sleep worth measuring food when it appeared thought compressed to the radius of the next immediate problem. The immediate problem was Daenerys. She had come out of Harrenhal with Drogon and Viserion, both intact enough to fly, and had lost roughly a third of her unsullied and nearly all of her Dothraki in the wildfire and the collapse. She rode at the head of what remained with the posture of someone carrying their composure in both hands and refusing to set it down, regardless of how heavy it became. Jon fell into step beside her horse. "Rhaegal," he said. "Stable, at Dragonstone." She kept her eyes on the road. 6 weeks, Tyrion said. "Then that's what we have." He kept stride with the horse's walk. "When this column reaches the Trident, I want to send the wounded toward the Reach and keep the capable fighters moving north." She looked at him then. "North?" "Whatever apocalypse is heading toward it will leave the road open behind it. And that road is the only terrain we have that isn't burning or being consumed from the inside." He watched her face. "I'm not asking you to fly into it. I'm asking you to be positioned to respond when there's something to respond to." She was silent for a moment. The column ground around them boots, on frozen earth wheels turning unevenly. The occasional sound of someone who had been holding themselves together, deciding they couldn't anymore. "What does Bran say?" Daenerys said. "I haven't spoken to him since before the engagement." "Then find out before you move anyone." She looked at the road ahead. "I will not send men into a second catastrophe, because we moved before we knew what we were moving into." Jon nodded once and dropped back to find a horse that could carry a message. Third, Bran had been watching since before Harrenhal fell. He sat in the dim room at Winterfell, always the same room now. The same low fire, the same stillness, and the Weirwood network showed him things in the sequence. It always showed them in the order of connection rather than importance. The way branching routes found water rather than the way a commander arranged a report. He saw the scattered column south of Harrenhal. He saw the green-stained sky above the ruin. He saw much further toward the wall, the advancing host not winter as weather, but winter as will the indiscriminate press of risen corpses southward through villages emptied by flight or death, through farmland that would not produce again for years, through territories that had been marginal, even in good seasons, and were now simply erased. He saw apocalypse in the network as a pressure change, a very large weight shifting through the substrate of things registered by the oldest roots, the way deep stone registered tremors, moving toward the wall. Crossing terrain at a rate that had nothing to do with legs or roads or any mechanism the roots could name. He saw the geometry of what was going to happen at Moat Cailin, two enormous forces closing on the same choke point from opposite directions, a strip of living people between them. The math of it as clear and cold as a diagram. He came back to the room. Mira was asleep in the chair by the door. He had lost track of what hour it was. He wrote 3 lines on a piece of parchment and woke her. "Send this to Jon," he said, "and to Tyrion, and to whoever at Dragonstone can still receive." Mira took it without looking and went to find the Meister. Mark, the message reached the column's makeshift camp that evening. Tyrion read it by firelight, read it again, then sat with it on his knee and ran it against everything else he knew until he ran out of ways to argue with it. The host is 3 days from Moat Cailin. It will arrive before any human force can. The only thing currently standing between them and the Riverlands is the thing that just burned Harrenhal. It is not going there to save anyone. It is going there because it will not permit something else to finish what it started. This buys time. Not safety. Time. Use it. He found Jon at the fire nearest the perimeter, sitting with the blunt economy of a man who had stopped spending energy on anything non-essential. "You've read it," Jon said, looking at the parchment. "Just now." Tyrion sat. The fire was small wood rationed, which told you something about how comprehensively the campaign's logistics had collapsed. He's right about the geometry. If that host breaks through Moat Cailin, everything south of the neck is open. No second line, no fallback. He looked into the fire. Apocalypse going toward the wall doesn't fix that. It means the catastrophe arrives in a different sequence. But slower, yes. How much time? If Bran's estimates hold, and whatever apocalypse can do to an army of the Risen takes something like what it took him to process Harrenhal. Tyrion paused. A week, perhaps 10 days. Jon looked at the dark horizon. Enough to get surviving forces to a defensible position south of Moat Cailin. Enough to get surviving people there. Whether the position holds afterward depends on what comes back down that track. Tyrion rubbed his eyes. "Which we don't know. Which is the part I can't plan around." "We've never been able to plan around it," Jon said. "That hasn't changed." He rose the borrowed cloak, settling around him. "Send riders toward the neck. Scouts, not fighters. I want to know the host's advance as close to the hour as we can manage. The scouts will be riding toward it." "I know." He met Tyrion's eyes directly. "Ask for volunteers." Tyrion noted not for the first time that Jon Snow's authority derived not from title or birth or rhetoric, but from the fact that he asked nothing of other people he hadn't already demonstrated a willingness to do himself. It was Tyrion reflected the most exasperating kind of leadership to work against. "I'll ask," he said. "Mermut." Across the Riverlands, through night-dark roads and frozen fields, the news spread in the only way it could travel, in a world where ravens were scarce and running out by mouth by foot, by one frightened person passing what they knew to another and receiving fear back in exchange. What the news said depended on who was saying it. At a way station south of the God's Eye, a merchant who had been waiting out the fighting in the innkeeper's cellar emerged to find his guards gone. His horses gone, the road carrying a vibration he could not name. He prayed to whatever god still seemed worth addressing, which was most of them. At the ruins of a sept near the Blue Fork, a red priest stood before a handful of sheltering people. and told them that the fires of the Lord were consuming the fires of the false risen, that the great war of light and darkness had entered its final movement, that what moved through the land was not ruin, but purification. A woman in the back of the group, she had walked from White Harbor in the weeks since the harbor fell and had developed through sustained exposure to catastrophe a sharp immunity to comfort, said, "There are two of them, and they're both going to Moat Kylan, and neither of them is on our side." Nobody answered her. She left before the priest finished and continued moving south, which had been her direction for weeks, and remained, in the absence of better information, the correct one. Apocalypse crossed the god's eye on the fourth day after Harrenhal, moving north-northeast at the rate of something operating from priorities rather than schedules. He had processed the castle engagement with the thoroughness he applied to all evidence. The alliance had been larger than forecast, better organized than the individual capabilities of its components should have produced, and had shown a tactical awareness of terrain that the preliminary assessment had not predicted. It had still fallen short. The distance between better than expected and adequate remained vast. More notable was the secondary action. The explosive material in the foundations had been placed by the King's Landing faction, not the Dragon Queen, not the Northern Commander, but the woman who had committed soldiers while retaining distance. She had been willing to destroy her own coalition, rather than allow it to succeed under someone else's direction. He had cataloged this disposition in other places, across other centuries. Priority of self over continuation of world. It was not rare. It was one of the things he intended to address here, later. Ahead, the terrain was changing. Through the substrate, the compression of extreme cold in the water table, the signature of mass death in large quantities, the absence of thermal registers that living things produced even in hard seasons, he read what lay ahead. The risen host moved without warmth. They registered as cessation rather than temperature, and the cessation was spreading at a rate that would swallow Moat Kylan in under 3 days. He moved faster. This was not mercy. He had no use for mercy as a governing principle. This was the refusal to accept that the work he had arrived to do would be completed by an indiscriminate mechanism, one that honored no distinction between the adequate and the worthless, the strong and the merely persistent, the ones worth pressing and the ones who had already answered their own question. The host would take everyone, the woman moving south from the sept, the merchant from his cellar, the fighters who had held at Harrenhal, and the ones who had broken and run. All of them leveled into the same gray silence, no selection made, no standard applied, no judgment rendered. He would not permit that. They deserved to be found wanting on proper terms. They deserved the pressure that either broke them or revealed something underneath worth keeping. The cessation marching toward them offered neither. The marshland spread before him as the terrain flattened and the trees thinned the earth, going soft and gray-brown. Beneath its crust of ice, the smell of stagnant water rising with the elevation drop. In the distance, barely visible through the winter haze, the stone teeth of Moat Kylan stood against a sky the color of ash. And beyond them, close enough that even the roots of the oldest weirwoods were registering the pressure, close enough that the air above the marsh tasted of what was coming. The host. The earth under his feet split in long, dark lines as he covered the last distance, the terrain recording what passed over it in the only register it had left. He came to meet them. The marsh had swallowed 3 towers already. Not to the water, to the weight of what was crossing it. The western tower of Moat Kylan had stood for 4,000 years on foundations driven into the bog, and it stood still. But the earth around it had been compacted by the passage of the risen host in numbers that turned the margin between fort and swamp into a single surface of black mud and broken reeds. And what had been, until recently, people. The causeway that connected the tower to the main fortification was underwater. The main fortification had a hole in its northern wall that nobody had made. Jon stood on what remained of the eastern bank and watched the host come on. There was no front to it. That was the first thing that became clear. He had fought battles with fronts, with flanks, with the logic of two forces meeting along a shared line. This had none of that. The Risen came through the marsh on a width that turned the concept of flanking into a question without an answer, pressing southward, the way water pressed through a cracked vessel, not charging, not advancing in any tactical sense, simply moving because there was nothing currently stopping them from moving. The figures in the water were wrong limbs, at angles that living bodies didn't sustain, movement patterns that suggested nothing inside them cared whether the terrain was navigable. The northern force that had been trying to hold the causeway was gone. Not retreated. Gone. 300 men, the count had said at dawn. Whatever the count was now, it was a different number and a different category. "Pull back to the stone ridge," Jon said to Tormund, who was 6 feet away and had the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised by catastrophic things and had moved into a register of professional grimness on the other side of it. "Everyone who can still move them back. Let the water do the work for us. If they have to cross deeper ground, they cross slower." "They don't breathe," Tormund said. "Depth doesn't matter to them the same. It matters to how fast they can cross. Move." Tormund moved. Jon turned back to the marsh. The host kept coming. The sound of them was low and constant and wrong. Not the sounds of an army, no voices, no clash, just the sound of very many bodies moving through water and reed and mud. The wet percussion of it, the occasional crack that was probably bone and probably not from anything recent. The fog sat low over the marsh and blurred the further reaches of the advance into a gray mass that suggested infinite depth, which it didn't have, but might as well have. Davos appeared at Jon's shoulder. "Scouts say it's at least 2 miles wide." "I know. Jon, we can't hold 2 miles with what we have. We're not holding 2 miles. We're holding the 100 yards between them and the people behind us." He watched the nearest figures clearing the deep water and finding the shallower ground near the bank. "As long as we hold, that it counts." It was the kind of statement that was true and also insufficient, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said anything further about it. The earth moved at the 3rd hour. Not from the host, from behind them. From the south. Jon felt it through his boots. Before he heard it, a vibration in the frozen substrate that had a different quality from the constant low pressure of the host's advance. Heavier. More purposeful. The kind of movement that wasn't caused by many small things, but by one very large thing that had decided to go somewhere. He turned. Apocalypse came through the line of trees at the southern approach to the causeway. And the scale of him hit the human forces the way it always did. Not with fear exactly, not after Harrenhal, but with a specific recalibration that happened when the thing you had learned to fear was suddenly standing next to something you feared more, and you had to rearrange the entire architecture of what your body was prepared to respond to. He walked through the remnants of Jon's line without slowing, not through them, around them. The way a river went around Asonia, the human defenders simply ceasing to be relevant to his trajectory. He did not look at Jon. He reached the edge of the bank and stepped into the marsh. The water did not behave normally around him. It pulled back from where he stepped, not much, not dramatically, but enough as though the marsh itself was getting out of the way of something it recognized as having a claim on the territory. He moved into the water, and the host came on toward him, and the two forces closed the distance between them with the quality of a collision that had been inevitable since before either of them arrived here. He reached into the marsh floor. What came up was not stone. There was no stone in this bog, only layers of compacted reed and peat, and the accumulated dead of centuries of flooding. What came up was all of that plus the bones in it. Rib cages, femurs, the skulls of men and horses from battles older than the current kingdoms. The bog had been collecting dead for 4,000 years, and Apocalypse pulled it to the surface in a wave that swept outward from him in both directions along the bank, a ridge of ancient wreckage rising out of the black water like a continent surfacing. The leading edge of the host hit it. The impact was not clean. Nothing about this marsh was clean, but it was decisive. The risen piled into the bone ridge, and the bone ridge held, because it was not being held by anything that could be killed. And the accumulated weight of the host pressing against it began to build in the way water built behind a dam, the pressure increasing with each body that added itself to the press. Apocalypse walked into the center of it. The white figures closest to him were taken apart in ways that left nothing intact enough to stand again. The mechanism of whatever kept the risen functioning was not immune to having its structure eliminated at a fundamental level. And he eliminated it without apparent effort, moving through the press of the host, the way a blade moved through water rather than against it. The cold that clung to the risen broke against him and dissipated. The figures he passed through left behind nothing that could reform. Jon was watching from the bank. He had been in battles. He had stood inside them and made decisions and taken wounds and watched men die on either side of him. He had understood himself in those moments as a participant, as someone whose actions changed the shape of what was happening. He understood himself now as a witness. There was nothing he could do to the scale of what was happening in the marsh that was not in the category of rounding error. The force of the host pressed southward, and the force that moved through it pressed north, and the two forces occupied the same geography, and the geography was being destroyed by the meeting of them. The bog churned. The bone ridge shattered in sections and was rebuilt in others. The fog burned off over the central conflict, as though the heat of it, not fire heat, something else. The heat of competing physics had dissolved the moisture from the air. Tormund appeared beside him, said nothing. They watched together. The Night King came at the 6th hour. He came from the back of the host, or rather from the center of it, moving forward through the ranks of his own risen as they fell or were taken apart. His pace unhurried in the way of a general who had never needed to hurry, because the eventual outcome had always been beyond challenge. He was tall, and his armor was pale as the ice it had been formed from, and his eyes carried the cold that the marsh had been failing to produce on its own. He had raised every body between the wall and this causeway. He would raise the ones that fell here too. That was the logic of his existence. Every death fed the machine. He reached Apocalypse in the center of the marsh. What happened between them did not translate cleanly into the vocabulary of combat that Jon had. There was no opening exchange of blows in the way two swordsmen opened. There was a collision of principles. The cold that radiated from the Night King meeting the force that radiated from Apocalypse, the two pressures occupying the same space and refusing to yield the marsh between them, responding to the contest by doing things that marshes did not do. Water moving against current ice, forming and shattering, in the same second the ground under the water shifting, as though the foundations of the bog were being restructured from below. The risen host hesitated. This was the first time Jon had seen the host hesitate. The effect moved through them the way a signal moved through a rope, the front ranks already in contact with whatever Apocalypse was doing to the water and the earth, and the physical laws governing the area stopped their forward press. The ranks behind collided with the stopped ones. The mass compressed, and the compression sent stress fractures back through the formation. Not breaks, not retreats, but the first indication that the machine had a point of input. Apocalypse drove his hand into the marsh floor. What rose was not bone this time. It was ice. Not the Night King's ice, not the blue-white product of the other's magic, but ice. In the physical sense, water forced through phase change by pressure applied at the molecular level, rising in columns through the black water and shattering the risen figures within them from the inside. column after column moving outward from the point of contact, in a line that tracked along the host's leading edge and then curved back into the mass of it, the ice columns rising and falling and rising again, each one leaving behind a field of broken figures that stayed broken. The Night King raised his arms. The fallen figures in the marsh began to move again. Apocalypse looked at him across the water. Between them, the marsh had become something that had no name in Westerosi. A terrain of competing principles, ice and physics, death and selection, the cold logic of elimination, and the colder logic of judgment. The fog had retreated to the edges. The light was wrong. The water between them had stopped moving in any direction gravity could account for. The Night King advanced. The exchange that followed was not long. Jon watched it from the bank with the feeling of a man watching a translation of something into a language he had 3 words of. He understood fragments, isolated moments of recognizable impact. The Night King's cold pressed against Apocalypse and was absorbed rather than deflected. Apocalypse's structural attacks on the marsh around the Night King forced the figure to redirect attention from maintaining the host to maintaining his own integrity. The host without full maintenance frayed at the edges, the further ranks losing coherence, the nearer ranks sustaining but not advancing. The Night King drove a lance of ice the length of 10 men directly through Apocalypse's chest. Apocalypse looked at it, closed his hand around it, pulled it through rather than out, the ice fracturing as it passed through the biomorphic matter of his body rather than lodging in it. The material sealed behind it. The Night King watched this happen. Then Apocalypse reached across the distance between them and took the Night King by the throat. The sound it made was not the sound of a battle ending. It was the sound of a principle being rescinded, a cold so deep it had been operating as law for 10,000 years, deciding under sufficient pressure to stop. The risen host went still in a single moment, all of them, every figure in the marsh from the nearest to the furthest edge of the fog, and then they began to fall. The way bodies fell when the thing maintaining them as anything other than bodies ceased to function. They fell into the marsh. The water took them. The marsh received them back. The host was gone. Jon stood on the bank in the sudden absence of the pressure that had been pressing south for days. His ears were ringing. The man on his left was on his knees in the mud, without appearing to know when he had gotten there. The causeway, what was left of it, was covered in the fallen figures of the host, already beginning to sink, already less than they had been, the cold that had held them dissipating like smoke without a fire. Tormund said something. Jon could not hear it yet. He looked at the marsh. Apocalypse stood in the center of it, in the water up to his knee in the fog-free air that had settled over the site of the engagement. He was still, not resting. He showed no sign of having needed the engagement to cost him anything. Still in the way of a thing that had concluded a task and had not yet decided on the next one. Jon thought about what Bran had said. It is not going there to save anyone. The marsh was littered with fallen figures and broken ice, and the product of a collision between 2 forces that had each been separately the apocalypse that this world was going to end in. One of them was gone. The other was standing in the middle of the ruins, deciding what to do next. And what it decided next would have nothing to do with the 6,000 survivors who had made it to the stone ridge south of the causeway, except insofar as those survivors constituted the material for the next phase of its work. Bran's voice, not his actual voice, but the impression of it in the weirwood signal that Jon had learned imperfectly to sometimes receive, registered a single thought: winter lost. The world did not win. Apocalypse stood in the marsh until the last of the fallen figures had settled into the water. The entity he had destroyed had operated on a principle of total erasure. Every death, a resource. Every resource converted into more erasure, The logic of it, self-sustaining and ultimately self-defeating. Because an erasure that completed itself left nothing. He had ended that. Not to preserve what was here. To preserve the conditions under which what was here could be properly evaluated. The marsh tasted of iron and old ice, and the specific absence of something very old. He turned south. The continent behind him was diminished. Its armies broken its symbols, shattered its alliances, dissolved back into the component grievances that had always constituted them. This was appropriate. A world that had taken this much pressure and still produced at its rims and in its corners the raw material of resistance, of refusal of the woman walking south, who didn't pray that world was not finished being tested. He began to walk. The ground split behind him in long, dark lines, and the lines were the only epitaph the marsh received. The sea had been wrong for 2 days before he arrived. Not storming the narrow sea in deep winter was always violent, always gray, always producing the kind of weather that made experienced sailors discuss alternatives. This was different. The tide had reversed twice in a single morning. Each reversal accompanied by a low vibration in the volcanic rock of the island that the servants felt in their feet and described afterward as the island breathing, which was not a geological phenomenon, but was also not entirely wrong. The gulls had gone. The seals that habitually occupied the rocks below the eastern approach had gone. The water around the island's base had taken on a quality that was not color, exactly, not darker or lighter, but texture, the surface of it moving in patterns, inconsistent with wind direction. Daenerys stood at the window of the high chamber and watched the sea and did not say what she was thinking. What she was thinking was, he's coming here. She had known it since Bran's last message, which had said nothing about Dragonstone specifically, but had mapped the direction of travel with the kind of geometric inevitability that made specific statements unnecessary. She had been here before, when the answer to an approaching threat was to fly out and meet it on her terms and return having proved something. She had done that once already to the north of the ruined harbor. She had learned from it. What she had learned was not to retreat. What she had learned was to choose the ground. Tyrion found her in the map room an hour before dawn, standing over the table with the charts she had stopped updating 3 days ago because the situation they depicted had ceased to resemble the situation they were in. He crossed the God's Eye Road yesterday morning, he said. My estimate puts him at the eastern shore by nightfall. I know. Daenerys. He stopped on the other side of the table. Rhaegal is 6 weeks from flying in any engagement capacity. Drogon and Viserion are healthy, but they are 2 dragons against something that 2 dragons did not stop at the coast, and now that same something has spent the intervening weeks processing a major military engagement and a confrontation with the Night King. It has more information than it had before. We have less. I have the same dragons I had before. You had the same dragons before, and the result was Rhaegal's wing and a retreating position. He kept his voice even and steady. I'm asking you to consider that the correct move here is not to meet him on the shore. She looked up from the charts. The torchlight caught the lines of her face, the composed surface of it. The thing underneath that was not composure, but had learned to wear it. And if I don't meet him on the shore, if I pull back from Dragonstone, take what's left of the fleet, and go where southeast? She shook her head once. Every lord who still has a decision to make is watching this island. If I abandon it without a fight, the decision they make will not be in my favor. They may not be in a position to make decisions much longer regardless. Then I make my stand while they're still watching. She turned from the table. Prepare the wings. Before dawn.
Give her a bit of time.
Tyrion stood with the charts for a moment after she left. He had known from the way she had been standing when he entered that the conversation had already happened in her head before he arrived to have it. She had run through his arguments, found the response to each, and arranged herself accordingly. The most he had ever been able to do in those situations was slow the clock slightly. He had not slowed it tonight. Drogon and Viserion rose from the courtyard as the eastern sky began to show the first evidence of the sun. It was not going to produce. No sun today. The cloud cover was total of flat iron ceiling from horizon to horizon, the kind of winter sky that made the sea below it look like hammered pewter. Daenerys flew east. She had ridden into battle on Drogon's back so many times that the pre-engagement feeling had its own texture by now. The narrowing, the compression of everything peripheral until only the immediate and the actionable remained. She had found over time that this narrowing was not courage exactly. It was more like the management of awareness, routing everything through a single channel, blocking the inputs that did not serve the next decision. Today the channel carried more than usual. She knew what had happened at Harrenhal. She knew what had happened at Moat Cailin, knew it from Bran's message, and from what Tyrion had assembled from scouts, and from the quality of the silence that had settled over the war room when word arrived that the Night King was gone. Not defeated, which would have produced a different kind of silence. Gone, which produced the silence of people who had expected one specific apocalypse and received a different one instead. Dragonstone appeared below her, the black volcanic rock, the towers, the great hall with its carved stone table, the bridges that connected the structure to itself across the internal drops. It was her birthplace. It was her inheritance. It was the first piece of ground in Westeros she had stood on with the full weight of who she was, and when she looked at it from above, she felt the pull of it as something more than property. This was the thing she was defending, not the stone, not the strategic position, the claim that she had a right to exist in this world as the thing she was. She saw apocalypse when she was still a mile out. He had come from the eastern approach, crossing the last stretch of sea on whatever mechanism he used, to cross things that should have stopped him. He stood on the largest of the rock platforms below the castle's eastern wall. Dark against the gray water, immense, and the armor catching the flat winter light in the way that metal caught light when there was no warmth in it to reflect. He was looking up at her. Viserion. She signaled with her knee, and the pale dragon peeled off to the left, gaining altitude for the angle of approach. Drogon. She brought him down. Dracarys. The flame hit the rock platform, and the rock face above it, and the sea beyond it. Simultaneously, Drogon pouring the full measure of what he was into, a sustained column that turned the volcanic rock surface to running liquid at the edges. Behind her, Viserion's fire crossed from the left, the two streams meeting over the platform in a convergence that she had used once to end a siege that had lasted 4 years. The steam cleared. He was still standing on the rock. His arm came up, and the sea moved not a wave, not a tide, but a directed column of water 40 feet high that came off the surface of the narrow sea and struck Viserion from below as he completed his pass. The force of it not enough to bring the dragon down, but enough to abort the run and send him twisting sideways in the air, his trajectory replaced by recovery. He was unhurt. The message was not about hurting. The message was, I can reach you anywhere in this sky. Daenerys pulled Drogon into a climbing turn and felt the arithmetic of the situation settling into her bones, with a cold precision that was not fear and was not resignation and was not any single thing she had a good name for. She had expected this. She had known at some level of knowing she did not examine directly that 2 dragons were not the answer she needed them to be. She had come anyway. She brought Drogon around for the second pass. He hit the castle wall from the outside, not the platform, the wall above it. The ancient volcanic stone that had been placed by Valyrian hands 4 centuries ago and had stood through everything the sea had sent at it since. The stone sheared away in two large sections, the upper courses sliding outward and down toward the water. In a movement that was almost slow, the kind of slow that very large things achieved when they fell. The gap it left in the eastern curtain wall was 30 feet wide and showed the interior of the secondary courtyard. The handlers running a cart, overturning the stones of the courtyard itself, cracking along the lines where the foundations of the wall had redistributed their load. Daenerys wheeled Drogon hard and brought him back lower, Viserion converging from the north, both of them working the approach angles with the efficiency of long practice and the desperation of an increasingly specific situation. The third pass. The fourth. The platform below the wall was molten at the edges, and structural stone was burning where organic material had caught in the cracks. Sections of the castle's outer face had lost integrity. She could see it from above, the way certain surfaces had gone from crisp to granular. The slow dissolution of what had been, until very recently, invulnerable. Apocalypse worked his way up the wall. Not climbing, adjusting the armor, and the body beneath it flowing through the stone the way something flowed through a medium it had sufficient authority over. He came up through the substance of the eastern wall and emerged from the castle's interior face in the secondary courtyard. And what he had done to the wall on the way through was not visible until the section collapsed 2 minutes after he cleared it. He was inside Dragonstone. Daenerys understood immediately what that meant. The castle's defensive geometry was built around keeping threats on the outer face. Once inside the layout that had made Dragonstone impregnable, became a maze that worked against the defenders. Narrow passages. Interior drops the specific cramped architecture of a fortress that had been designed for magical defense rather than conventional siege. She brought Drogon down to the main courtyard. "Everyone out," she said to the two guards who had not already run. "Eastern wall toward the harbor." She went in on foot. The interior of Dragonstone was the same as it had always been: stone floors, stone ceilings, the carved faces of old Valyrian dragons watching from the walls. The smell of volcanic rock that was specific to this island and no other place. She had walked these corridors in the months since arriving, and learned them the way she had learned very few places in her life, not as tactical terrain, but as home. She found him in the Great Hall. He stood at the far end of it, beside the stone table that was shaped like the outline of Westeros, and he was looking at the table with the attention of someone who had already understood what it represented, and was considering what that representation indicated about the people who had made it. She had her sword. It was a formality, and she knew it was a formality, and she drew it anyway. "You came here," she said. He looked at her. The pale gaze moved across her with the quality she had come to recognize. Not contempt, not aggression, something more systematic than either. "This was your seat of power," he said. His voice in the stone room was deep and unhurried, each word carrying the weight of something that had not needed to speak quickly for a very long time. "The first ground you stood on when you returned to claim what you believed was yours. It is mine. You came back to prove a point at the coast," he said. "You came back today to prove the same one. You will continue to come back and continue to prove it until there is nothing left to come back to." He looked at the table again. "That quality is not weakness. It is the reason I haven't ended this conversation." The hall was silent, except for the sound of the sea against the outer walls and the distant deep groan of compromised stone somewhere in the structure. "What do you want?" she said. "I want what I came here for." He turned from the table and faced her fully. "A world that has been pressed hard enough to show what it's made of. You are part of that material. Your dragons are part of it. Whether what remains of your inheritance constitutes something worth carrying forward." He paused. "That determination is still being made." Daenerys stood in the hall of her birthplace, with a sword that would do nothing to the thing in front of her, and looked at the carved dragon faces on the walls and thought about fire and blood and the 400 years of her family's story that had arrived in this room at this moment. She did not lower the sword. That was the only thing she had. When she came out of the hall, the eastern tower was gone. Not collapsed, gone taken apart at its base and distributed across the rock face below, in a pattern that suggested deliberate deconstruction rather than failure. The section of curtain wall that had already lost integrity had come down entirely, opening the secondary courtyard to the sea wind. 3 of the 4 bridges were intact. The 4th had sheared at the midpoint and hung at an angle, the far end trailing into the drop below. Drogon was on the main courtyard. Viserion had landed on the harbor steps. Neither was injured. They were simply grounded, not by force, but by something in the quality of the air around the castle that made flight feel like the wrong answer to the available questions. Daenerys had felt it when she landed and felt it still. Tyrion was waiting in the main yard with the expression he wore when the situation had confirmed his analysis, and he took no satisfaction from the confirmation. "He's leaving," Tyrion said. She looked toward the eastern approach. The rock platform below the ruined wall was empty. The sea beyond it was moving normally again. The tide was where it should be. The surface pattern was what wind accounted for. "He could have killed us," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Why didn't he?" Tyrion was quiet for a moment. "I don't think he's finished with us. I think there's a difference between something being defeated and something being assessed, and we haven't finished being assessed yet." He looked at the missing tower, which is considerably worse than being defeated when you think about it long enough. She sheathed the sword, looked at the hole in the eastern wall where the tower had been the raw edge of the volcanic stone, the gray sky visible through it, where there had been architecture. Dragonstone was still standing. Parts of it. The symbol had not survived intact. At Winterfell, Jon received the news by Raven 3 hours later. Brief factual, written in Tyrion's hand, Dragonstone breached. Eastern Tower gone. Dragons intact, but grounded temporarily. The Queen is alive. He did not stay. Jon read it once and set it down and looked at the candle on the table until the wax had run another half-inch. He had grown up knowing that fire and blood were the answer to power, that ropes of descent and the oldest names and the things that burned hottest were the things that lasted. Westeros had run on that logic for as long as anyone had been writing things down. The candle went on burning. Outside, the wind had the character of true winter, not the season, not the weather, but the permanent condition that the North had been warning about since before anyone in the South had believed it worth worrying over. Stone and dark and endurance and the old names carved into the crypt below. He picked up his pen. It was time to go back to the beginning. Winterfell had stopped feeling like a fortress some time ago. Jon could not have named exactly when, whether it was before Harrenhal or after Moat Cailin, or somewhere in the weeks of retreating and regrouping that had compressed into a blur of frozen roads and bad news. But standing in the outer yard in the pre-dawn dark, he could feel that the transition had happened. The walls were the same height. The towers still stood. The gates still functioned. And yet, the quality of the place had changed in the way that a living thing changed when it had been through too much for too long. Still present, still upright, but carrying its history as weight rather than pride. There were perhaps 400 people in the castle. 3 weeks ago, there had been twice that. The ones who had left were not deserters. Desertion implied a cause worth deserting. They had simply gone quietly toward family or distance, or the calculation that open country was more survivable than a fixed position. when the thing bearing down on you did not care about walls. Jon understood the calculation. He stayed anyway. Davos found him at the entrance to the main hall. The Eastern Watch reported ground movement. Northeast approach past the burned village. How far? An hour, maybe less, at whatever pace it travels. Jon looked at the yard, the remnants of the garrison. 40 men in their positions at the walls, the rest who had been sleeping now awake and standing in the way, of people who had been woken by something they could feel, rather than hear. He had kept Longclaw at his side since Harrenhal. He checked it now by reflex, the grip familiar in a way nothing else about the last several weeks had been. "Get everyone off the main wall," he said. "The ramparts are the wrong place for this." "Where then?" "Down. The inner yard, the great hall." He paused. "The crypts." Davos looked at him with the expression of a man who had learned not to question Jon's instincts about where to be, but still felt the need to register that the instinct was unusual. "The crypts. He'll go there. Whatever else he does first, he'll go there." Jon could not have explained how he knew this, any more than he could have explained why he had slept in the small room off the great hall rather than the Lord's chambers since returning to Winterfell. Some things were known through the feet rather than the head. "I want to be there first." The crypts of Winterfell ran deep. 4 levels in some sections, cut from the rock of the hill itself, the passages too narrow for 2 men to walk abreast, and the ceilings low enough that Jon had to angle his head in the older sections. The torches set in the wall sconces gave a light that was more about direction than visibility. Enough to navigate, not enough to see the faces of the statues until you were close. The statues were the point. Every lord of Winterfell, for 3,000 years, seated in stone at the mouth of their own alcove. Iron swords across their knees, the swords placed there not for ceremony, but because the Starks had believed in the old superstitious way that ran deeper than reason, that iron kept the dead quiet. The faces carved from memory and imperfect record grew less accurate the deeper you went. The oldest lords, reduced to approximations of faces rather than portraits, the features worn by time into something more general and more ancient than any specific man. Jon walked the upper level with a torch and the sound of his own breathing. Ned Stark's alcove was in the upper tier. The statue was recent enough to be recognizable. The long face, the heavy jaw, the look of someone who had spent too many years carrying problems that other people had put down. Jon stopped there for a moment, not praying, not reminiscing, just stopping the way you stopped at a familiar place that had been changed without your consent. He put his hand on the stone sword across the effigy's knees. The iron was cold. In the way iron got cold in deep places, a specific mineral cold that was different from weather, that came from the earth rather than the air. He took it and went deeper. Tank, Apocalypse entered Winterfell through the northern gate. He did not force it. The gate had been braced, but not sealed the mechanism for sealing. It had been broken in a skirmish 2 years ago, and never repaired, because the Lord of Winterfell had always believed that a sealed gate was a liability once your enemy was already inside. Jon had never fixed it either. He had grown up in a world where the gate was the thing you stood in front of, not the thing you hid behind. The 40 men on the ramparts fired what they had. Crossbow bolts, a jar of burning pitch that one man dropped, rather than threw 2 long arrows from the castle's remaining archers. The bolts struck the dark armor and fell away. The burning pitch hit the ground 3 feet short. The arrows landed better, both finding gaps in the armor's surface, and both were registered in the same way, absorbed, rather than deflected, the armor resettling around the points of impact and closing. He walked through the outer yard without pause. The men who had been in the yard moved out of it, which was the correct decision and the one Jon had told them to make. They moved to the great hall and the inner buildings and the covered passages, which was not safe, but was better than open ground, and better still was what Jon had told the eldest of them. If it matters, it will happen in the crypts, not here. The great hall was empty when Apocalypse crossed it. The high table, the banners of House Stark on the walls, gray direwolf on white, the colors muted in the torchlight, the long hearth with its banked fire. He moved through it without slowing past the banners and the hearth and the heavy oak door at the far end that opened onto the passage to the crypts. The door was already open, and Jon heard him before he saw him. Not footsteps. The rock didn't give footsteps from something that heavy in the way it gave footsteps from men. It gave a vibration instead, a frequency in the stone of the passage walls that Jon felt in his jaw and his back teeth, the same vibration he had felt through his boots at Moat Cailin, now translated through solid rock. He was standing in the second alcove, past the statue of Cregan Stark Longclaw in his right hand, and the iron sword from Ned's alcove in his left. The iron sword was not a fighting weapon, too short, too old, the blade edge worn to something more ceremonial than functional. He was holding it because it was the only other thing in the crypt that had been made to push against something. Apocalypse came around the bend in the passage, and the torchlight reached him. In the narrow confines of the crypt, he was too large. Not because he couldn't fit the space physically, but because his scale was wrong for the architecture, the way a very old building was wrong for furniture made to modern proportions. The ceiling came to his shoulder. The passage forced him to angle his body slightly, the armor adjusting to the constraint the way water adjusted to the shape of a vessel. He looked at the statues. Not at Jon. At the statues. His gaze moved along the alcoves with the same systematic attention he applied to everything each stone lord examined the iron swords, noted the accumulation of them, registering as data rather than reverence. 3,000 years of Stark lords seated in stone waiting for the end of the world with iron across their knees. Old, he said. It was one word. It was enough. Jon stepped forward. The first exchange in the crypts was nothing like any fight Jon had ever been in. The passage was too narrow for the forms he had trained in. The space didn't allow for the footwork or the shoulder rotation that proper sword work required. He was fighting in a tunnel against something that wasn't fighting back in any recognizable sense, that wasn't using the space, the way a swordsman used space, but simply occupying it and deflecting what reached it the way stone deflected rain. Longclaw hit the armor surface at the shoulder joint and slid. He was fast. With the follow, the iron sword angled low, finding a gap that was there for a half second, and the gap closed before the blade reached it. But the blade reached the edge of the gap and caught briefly before being redirected, not flung away, just redirected the arm that held it, experiencing the redirection as a force up through the wrist and elbow that was less painful than informative. That is what this is. That is what I am hitting. He backed up 2 steps. The crypt was long. He had room to move in one direction. Apocalypse looked at him, not with contempt, not with satisfaction, with the same quality of assessment that Jon had seen from the coastal plain onward, the look that collected information rather than communicated emotion. "You came here to stand in front of these," he said. His voice in the stone passage was very different from open air lower contained the resonance of the crypt, giving it a quality that had nothing to do with performance. Not to win, to be here when it happened. Jon kept Longclaw up. Yes? Why? Because someone should be. The silence in the crypt was absolute. No wind, no fire, only the torch guttering in the disturbed air of their proximity, and the stone faces watching from their alcoves, and the deep cold of the rock itself. Apocalypse moved. The section of passage behind Jon buckled not explosively, not in the manner of the harbor wall or the dragonstone curtain. but with a deliberate compression that narrowed the exit and rerouted the structural pressure along the passage floor. The flagstones cracking upward in a line that ran toward Jon's feet and forced him 3 steps sideways into the alcove wall. The alcove wall held. The statue in it, some lord of Winterfell, 3 centuries removed, name worn off the plinth, did not. The carved figure separated from its seat and fell slowly enough to avoid Jon and fast enough to fill the space he had been occupying with 800 pounds of ancient stone. The dust was immediate and total. Jon came through it moving because standing still in the dust was the same as standing still in the rubble, and standing still was the wrong answer to all of this. He found the passage wall with his free hand and used it for orientation and pushed forward through the white air toward where Apocalypse had been standing. The second exchange was worse. Jon got inside the arm's reach, got there genuinely. Longclaw making contact at the inner elbow joint where the armor surface was thinner, and the contact produced nothing except the specific sensation of hitting something that declined to be hurt. The force of his own strike redirected back through the blade into his arm, not a sharp pain, but a deep one. The kind that lived in bone rather than flesh. He held the grip. He held it because letting go was the same as saying that the iron in the crypts and the stone in the walls and the names on the plinths were decoration rather than substance. He held it, and Apocalypse looked at him through the dust. "You are not strong enough," Apocalypse said. "No. You know this." "I've known it since the coast." Jon kept his feet under him. The arm that had taken the force from Longclaw's redirect was warming into a throb that was going to be a serious problem in 10 minutes. "Knowing it doesn't change where I'm standing." The pause lasted long enough for the dust to begin settling. Particles of stone coming down, catching the torchlight, landing on the shattered plinth and the fallen statue and the floor of the crypt that had been flat before and was no longer. "No," Apocalypse said. "It doesn't." He turned. Not away from Jon's sideways attention shifted to the passage ahead, deeper into the crypts where the oldest lords sat in their alcoves. He walked forward, and Jon did not try to stop him, because Jon was no longer capable of stopping him, and both of them were aware of this fact. The passage ahead was narrow. Apocalypse moved through it. The oldest section of the crypt at the lowest level held lords with no names left on their plinths. The statues there were rougher early work, or work by hands that had not been trained, or simply work that had been worn down past recognition by the weight of the rock above. They sat in their alcoves and looked at nothing with faces that had been approximations of faces for centuries. Apocalypse stood among them for a long moment. Then the passage walls compressed, not violently, a sustained pressure, the rock moving inward, at a rate that cracked the plinth bases and tilted the statues and brought 2 of the oldest lords down onto the crypt floor, in pieces that scattered across the flagstones. The cracking sound moved up through the levels above. Jon could hear it standing at the upper passage with his arm against his chest and the dust settling on his shoulders, the sound of the deep crypt answering the pressure in the language of stone. Then it stopped. Footsteps, real footsteps now. Not vibration, the specific weight of something very large, moving back through a passage, and Apocalypse came back through the lower levels and past Jon without stopping past the fallen statue and the shattered plinth and up the stairs toward the great hall. Jon followed him to the crypt entrance and stopped there. The yard was empty. The great hall was empty. The northern gate stood open. He was gone. Nunt. Jon sat on the crypt stairs for a long time. The arm had resolved into a deep, persistent ache that ran from the wrist to the shoulder and would need splinting by morning. The dust had settled on him to the point where he tasted stone when he breathed. The torch had burned a third down. Arya found him there. She had been in the shadow near the inner wall, had been there. He understood from the quality of her stillness since before the thing entered the castle. She had watched it. She had not come in. She sat down on the step below him, and they were quiet for a moment, in the way that Starks were quiet with each other, the silence carrying more than the words would have. "You knew you weren't going to stop him," she said. "Yes. So you stood there anyway. Someone had to be in there with them." He looked at the crypt entrance. The torchlight from inside made a rectangle of yellow against the dark. "They've been down there a long time. They shouldn't have been alone for that." Arya was silent for a moment. He could feel her thinking not the anxious kind of thinking, but the sharp, practical kind, the kind that was cutting through what had just happened to find the usable piece of it. "Hitting it straight doesn't work," she said. "No." "Jon." She looked at him directly. "I need to go to King's Landing." He looked at her. "Not to fight it there," she said before he could answer. "To understand something about it. Bran thinks there's a gap in the way it rebuilds itself. Very small, very fast, but there. If that's real, it can't be found by someone swinging a sword at the front of it." She paused. "It has to be someone it doesn't see as a threat." The yard was dark around them, the wind moving through the open northern gate. Somewhere in the castle behind them, the surviving garrison was finding out whether they were still alive, which most of them were. Jon looked at his sister. The sharp face, the gray eyes, the stillness of someone who had made a decision before they announced it and was only now letting you catch up. "Go," he said. She was already standing. He watched her cross the yard and disappear through the inner gate and sat for a while longer on the crypt steps with the stone cold under him and the torch burning down and the names in the dark below him that no longer had their statues to put faces to. They were still there. The names were still carved. The stone was broken, but the names were still there. He supposed that was something. The Red Keep had been dying for weeks before she arrived. Not destroyed, the main structure still stood. The towers still reached their heights. The walls still enclosed the hill above King's Landing. But something essential had been withdrawn from it, the way water withdrew from a shore before a wave, and what remained was the architecture of power, without the current that had made architecture mean something. The corridors she moved through were intact and empty in equal measure. The torches burned out in their sconces, the floor scattered with the small debris of abandonment, a broken cup, a torn banner still half attached to its ring, a pair of boots with no one in them. She moved through the dark without a torch. She had done this before in other buildings, on other continents. The principle was always the same: learn the space faster than whatever was in it learned you. The Red Keep was large, and she had time, and she used both. The lower floors had been evacuated. Not in the organized way of a planned withdrawal, in the fractured way, a people who had decided individually and at different times that remaining was no longer the better option. She found 3 bodies in the servants' quarter corridor. Not violence, just people who had been old or ill and had not made it out. She stepped around them and continued. The floor above the great hall was where she first heard him. Not footsteps she had learned at Winterfell from Jon's account that footsteps were not the right word for what he produced. This was a resonance in the floor beneath her boots, a vibration that her feet picked up and her body translated into information. Before her mind had processed it, something very large moving with unhurried weight somewhere above her. She took the service stair. None. The upper corridors of the Red Keep had been built for ceremony, rather than function wide enough for a procession, ceilinged high enough for banners to hang without touching the floor. The walls faced with pale stone that reflected torchlight on ordinary evenings and now reflected nothing. In this dark, the corridors were wrong in a specific way, too wide. The width that had been designed to project authority now projected emptiness, the space between the walls measuring the absence of everything that had been meant to fill it. Arya stayed to the left wall, her shoulder occasionally brushing the stone, using the contact as anchor in the dark. The Valyrian steel dagger was in her hand. She had not decided to draw it. It had simply been there when she needed it to be the way things the body understood better than the mind did tended to appear. She heard him turn the far corner 60 feet ahead. The sound was not loud. It was the sound of something very large, adjusting its relationship to a space not quite proportioned for it. The faint groan of the floor distributing a weight. It had been built for humans and was now accommodating something else. She pressed into a doorway and waited. He came down the corridor. In the dark, she could not see his face, but she could see his shape, the scale of it filling the corridor, the way a very large piece of furniture filled a room designed for smaller pieces, the ceiling coming to just above the upper surface of the armor, the walls leaving less than 2 feet of clearance on each side. He moved with the kind of certainty that had nothing to do with visibility. He was not navigating. He was simply going where he had decided to go. She watched him pass. The armor surface was not static. She had known this from Jon's account, from Bran's fragmented messages, from the tactical summary. Tyrion had assembled from the coastal engagement records. She had known it intellectually. Seeing it at close range and near darkness was a different kind of knowing. The surface shifted. Not dramatically, not the gross morphological changes she had heard described from the large-scale engagements. This was smaller, constant automatic, the material at the boundaries of the armor's components, adjusting and readjusting, with each movement maintaining integrity under the stresses of motion, the way living tissue maintained integrity. It was not armor in the sense of a fixed shell. It was a process, a continuous one, and processes had intervals. She had watched the faceless men work with poisons that moved through the body in cycles, the heartbeat, the breath, the blink. Every system had a rhythm. Every rhythm had a low point. She had spent 3 years learning to find the low points in human systems. The question was whether the principle held for something that was not quite a human system. She followed him. He went to the throne room. She had expected this without quite articulating why the Iron Throne was the thing that the Red Keep had been built around the center, that the corridors and the halls and the towers and the walls organized themselves in relation to. Whatever he was looking for in this building, the throne room was the most coherent destination. She took the servant's access, rather than the main approach coming in through the narrow door behind the dais that the servants used for deliveries and cleaners used for maintenance, and that the court had used in times of need for discreet exits. The door was still functional. She came through it and stayed low and moved to the side of the dais behind the base of the Iron Throne itself. The throne room was enormous and in darkness, except for the glow that came through the high windows. King's Landing outside still lit in patches, the city's remaining fires casting a red-orange light that entered through the glass and lay across the floor in long distorted rectangles. By this light, the room was navigable. The 1,000 swords that made up the throne rose above her in their fused mass. The blades that had been melted together by Balerian's fire 4 centuries ago and shaped into the seat that every Targaryen conqueror had considered the rightful end of history. He stood in front of it. He was looking at the throne in the same way he had looked at the stone lords in the Winterfell crypts. Systematic, thorough, the attention of something that processed symbolic structures. The same way it processed physical ones as evidence of what a civilization believed about itself. Arya watched the armor surface. She was 12 feet from him, close enough to see the micro-adjustments clearly. The left shoulder plate, the junction between the shoulder and the upper arm, was where the intervals were most visible. Every 3 to 4 seconds, the material there completed a cycle expansion during movement load contraction, and then a half second in which the two surfaces had not quite rejoined before the next cycle began. The gap was not large. It was a line, barely a seam. The kind of thing you would not see if you were watching from a distance or looking at the whole rather than one specific point. She had been trained to look at one specific point. "Look with your eyes," Sirio had said. "Not your fear, not your expectation, not the story you've already decided the fight is telling. Your eyes." She watched the shoulder junction through 3 cycles, then 4. The interval was consistent. The half-second at the contraction point was real. She had one chance at this. Not because the opportunity wouldn't recur. The cycle would continue, but because one attempt was the maximum she could make before his attention became fully engaged with her. And the subsequent problem became unsurvivable rather than merely extremely dangerous. She moved. Fast across the floor, low, the dagger angled not for the torso or the obvious target, but for the shoulder junction at the precise half-second of the contraction point, her body doing the timing calculation the way it did. Timing calculations in the dark, with a sword not through thought, but through the integration of watching and muscle, and the practiced certainty of someone who had made this kind of entry 300 times in training, and twice in circumstances that mattered. The blade found the gap. The resistance was not what she expected, not the hard stop of metal against metal or the give of flesh, but something between those categories, a material that was neither fully solid nor fully yielding, that her blade entered by approximately 2 inches before the surrounding matter began to close around it. She pulled. What came away was not blood. It was a piece of the surface material, irregular in shape, roughly the size of her palm, dark in color, dense, in a way that she felt in the arm that had pulled it free. It was warm. The arm that came down was faster than anything she had seen. She was already moving. She had started moving the instant the blade cleared the gap. The body deciding before the mind had the full picture, and the arm came down where she had been and hit the dais stone with a force that sent a crack running 3 feet along the base of the throne and knocked loose one of the lower sword blades from the throne's mass, the ancient blade clattering down the dais steps and spinning across the floor. She was behind the throne's base, then behind a column, then through the servant's door. She ran. The corridors of the Red Keep were easier to move through quickly. Then slowly they were straight, they were wide and in total darkness. They were navigable by the feel of the left wall and the knowledge of where the stairwells were. She had memorized the route in. She ran it out in reverse, the dagger still in her right hand, and the piece of surface material in her left closed in a fist so tight she could feel the warmth of it against her palm. She did not look back. Not because she was certain he was not following. He might have been. She did not look back because looking back was the thing you did when you needed to know how much time you had. And she had already decided that the time she had was whatever the distance between her and the outer gate provided. And looking back would not change that. She came out into the lower ward, and across it and through the outer gate and onto the road below the hill. And she did not stop running until the walls of the keep were behind her, and the streets of King's Landing were around her, and the darkness was general rather than specific. She stopped, pressed her back against a wall, and breathed. The piece of material in her fist was still warm. She opened her hand and looked at it in the dim glow from a fire burning somewhere in the street above. It was approximately 2 inches thick. The surface of it was slightly convex, like a piece of scale rather than plate. The interior was darker than the exterior, the cross-section showing layers, not uniform layers, but organic ones, the kind of structure that came from a growing process rather than a manufacturing one. She turned it over. Then she sent a raven to Bran. Bran received the message 2 hours later. He read the description, the interval, the contraction point, the material composition she had observed, and sat with it for a long time in the dim room at Winterfell. What Arya had found was not a weakness. He needed to be precise about that. The intervals she had identified was not a flaw in the process. It was the process operating correctly. The material rebuilt itself continuously. What she had found was the seam in a heartbeat, not a crack in a wall. But the seam was real, if you could reach it. If you could hold the targeting through the movement. If you had enough of something force material property accumulated pressure to interrupt the cycle rather than just intrude into it. He wrote back to her in 3 lines. It is not a wound. It is a moment between one state and the next. To matter something would need to interrupt the transition rather than enter it. You found the right place. The question is whether the right thing exists to use it. Tell Jon. Tell Daenerys. Tell them separately. He folded the message and gave it to Mira. Outside the window of the dim room at Winterfell, the sky over King's Landing, visible at this distance only as a suggestion of light on the southern horizon, had changed quality. Not darker. More concentrated, the kind of light that came from a city that had been burning selectively and was about to burn comprehensively. Apocalypse was there. The last act of this was beginning, and the only instrument anyone had found against it was a half-second in a heartbeat, and the question of what, if anything, could be threaded through it before it closed. Bran looked at the light and waited. King's Landing had been consuming itself for 3 days before the ground began to shake. Not from siege, not from assault from the inside. The way cities consumed themselves, when the structures that organized collective behavior stopped functioning and the underlying desperation that those structures had been managing found its way to the surface. The bread markets had been empty since the 2nd day. The gold cloaks who remained at their posts did so in diminishing numbers. The ones who left not deserting in any disciplined sense, but simply not returning from their shifts, absorbed back into the city they were meant to police and becoming indistinguishable from it. The harbor had 3 ships left. 2 of them were already overloaded. Jon moved through the lower city on foot because horses were more dangerous than useful in streets this congested. The crowds had the specific density of people who had nowhere to go, but could not stop moving, pressing through the narrow ways in every direction. Simultaneously, the flow of them, contradictory groups moving north, meeting groups moving south with the friction of collision and reversal, and collision again. He pushed through it with Davos at his shoulder, keeping to the wall sides, reading the crowd the way he had learned to read terrain for openings, for the direction of real movement beneath the apparent movement, for the signs of where the pressure was highest and what it was building toward. The outer wards are gone, Davos said over the noise of it. Sir Bryndon's men held the river gate through the morning. Last report said they were down to 40. From the gate or from the original number? From this morning. Jon said nothing for a moment, stepping over a collapsed market stall, its goods scattered and trampled into the cobblestones. Cloth-broken pottery, the specific mixture of the expensive and the mundane that appeared when households were abandoned in a hurry. A woman with a child on her back was trying to move against the crowd. Flow from the opposite direction, making no progress. The child's face turned into her shoulder. Jon reached out, got a hand on her arm, pulled her sideways into the wall alcove where they were standing. "Stay against the wall," he said. "Move with the current, not against it." She looked at him without recognition. Not surprising, he was wearing no sigil, no identifiable armor, nothing that would have made a lord out of a face in this crowd. She nodded and held the child tighter and waited. He moved on. Tyrion had taken a position in the lower section of the Red Keep. Not the throne room, not the Great Hall, but a record chamber off the secondary approach that had windows on 2 sides and a door that latched properly. which made it more defensible than most of the rooms in the structure, and more importantly, gave him somewhere to sit while he thought. Daenerys was there when Jon arrived. She was standing at the eastern window looking at the city below, and the quality of her stillness was different from anything Jon had seen in her before. Not the composed stillness of a queen managing her composure, not the battle stillness of someone preparing for engagement. This was the stillness of someone who had already been through the engagement and was now watching the aftermath from a position she had not chosen and could not change. Drogon and Viserion were on the upper battlements. He had heard them when he crossed the outer yard, the low sound of their breathing, audible even at distance, the only thing in the entire city that was not human and not panicking. "The lower wards are gone," Jon said when the door was closed. Tyrion was at the table with a map that was 3 weeks out of date and still the most current thing available. "They've been gone since yesterday, functionally. The question isn't the lower wards anymore." "What's the question?" "Whether the people we can still reach can be moved to the upper city before..." He stopped, looked at the map. "Before the ground tells us he's arrived." The room was quiet. Outside, the sound of the city was constant and low, and layered in the way that large groups of frightened people were layered individual voices, lost in the aggregate becoming a tone, the tone carrying information about the collective state, the way weather carried information about what was coming. Daenerys turned from the window. "Rhaegal won't be ready." "I know," Jon said, "which means 2 dragons. And we know what 2 dragons accomplished the last time he was in open engagement." She said it without self-flagellation, without drama, the flat statement of a woman who had processed that fact and was now working with it rather than against it. "So tell me what we're doing that isn't that." "Arya's information." Jon looked at Tyrion. "Bran's analysis." Tyrion spread his hands. "A half-second interval in the surface reconstruction cycle, interrupting the transition rather than entering it." He paused. "Useful provided we can identify what has the property to interrupt it and get that thing to the right location at the right moment, while simultaneously surviving the engagement long enough to use it." "That's a great deal of simultaneously," Daenerys said. "Yes." Jon looked at the map. King's Landing spread across it in its geometric districts, the River Gate, the Dragon Gate, the Lion Gate, the harbor, the upper city, the lower city, the Red Keep at the center of all of it. A city built to be the convergence point of everything in Westeros, and now functioning as exactly that in the worst possible version of the premise. "We don't fight to hold the city," he said. "The city is already gone in the sense that matters. We fight to give us enough time to use what Arya found." He looked at Daenerys. "The dragons create pressure. They buy the interval. They don't need to hurt him. They need to occupy enough of his attention that the interval becomes accessible." She was quiet for a moment. "And if they can't occupy enough of his attention, then we use whatever comes next." He met her eyes. "We use everything we have left in the right order, and we accept that the order might not be optimal, and the outcome might not be what we need." The silence held for 3 seconds. He counted it the specific silence of people who had run out of better answers and were confirming that the answer in front of them was the one they were going with. "All right," she said. "Look, in the upper city, where the streets were wider and the houses taller, and the people who remained were the ones who had believed longest and most tenaciously that rank constituted protection, Cersei's world had contracted to 3 rooms. She was not cowering. It was important to herself that she was not cowering. She had withdrawn from the public-facing portions of the keep, because the public-facing portions of the keep were no longer public in any functional sense, and maintaining a position in them was performance without audience. These 3 rooms had windows and exits, and they were close enough to the lower foundations that she knew in the specific way she had always known the geography of her own safety. What lay beneath the floors? Qyburn was with her. He had been with her since the third day since the reports had stopped being reports and become the kind of raw information that arrived in fragments and contradictions and could only be interpreted by someone willing to accept that the underlying situation had changed faster than the information about it. "The northern gate is lost," he said. "I know. The river gate will follow within the hour based on the last count." "I know, Qyburn." He was quiet for a moment. The preparations at the lower level remain intact. The access points are undisturbed. Whatever has happened in the outer wards, nothing has reached the level below this. She looked at him. "If the city becomes indefensible," he said carefully, "the option remains." "The option," she said, "has always remained. That's what makes it an option." She turned to the window. Below the upper city was still holding its shape, the buildings intact, the streets merely congested rather than destroyed. From here, she could see 3 of the 7 hills and the harbor beyond the outer wall and the Blackwater Bay, where the overloaded ships were still at anchor, still taking on people who had coin enough to buy passage because coin was still the last language that functioned, even when everything else had stopped. She had no intention of dying in this city. She had lived in it long enough to understand every egress. The ships at anchor were not her only option, not even her primary one. What she intended was to ensure that if this city died, it died on terms she had set, rather than terms set by the thing that had been walking through Westeros for the past weeks, like a verdict that had been written before the trial. Let it come. Let it take the city if that was what it intended. It would take a city she had already prepared to unmake. That was not defeat. That was the only power left that no one could remove from her. Jaime found Jon in the lower yard of the Red Keep as the afternoon failed. He looked like what he was, a man who had been in continuous motion for too many days. The armor showing the accumulated damage of Harrenhal and everything after the sword at his hip. Not the golden one that had marked him as a Kingsguard, but something he had picked up from a battlefield and kept because it worked. His face had the quality of someone who had spent a long time looking at catastrophe and had achieved through sustained exposure a kind of clarity about it. "The bells stopped an hour ago," he said. Jon looked up. He had not noticed the silence where the bells had been. What happened to them? The bell ringers left. Jaime looked at the city beyond the keep walls. The smoke-stained sky above it, the specific shade of late afternoon light that fell through particulates in the air and turned everything the color of old bronze. When the people ringing the bells decide there's no point, that's usually a fairly accurate assessment. "We have a plan," Jon said. "I know. Tyrion told me." Jaime was quiet for a moment. "I'll be in the lower city, the river gate approach, if it comes through there." "Jaime, I'm not being heroic." He said it with the flat certainty of someone correcting a category error. "I'm being where I'm most useful, which is between the people who are still in the lower city and whatever is coming through the northern approach. Someone has to be there." Jon looked at him, the tired face, the worn armor, the sword that had been someone else's. There was a version of this conversation where he argued the point. It would not go anywhere. "Keep the river gate as long as you can," he said. "When you can't fall back to the upper city." Jaime nodded once, turned, walked back toward the inner passage. Jon watched him go and thought about what Bran had said weeks ago about everyone gathering in the place the thing had already chosen. He had been right. They were all here. Every piece of what had been Westeros's power, its queens and its lords, and its soldiers and its schemers and its survivors converged on this city that had already decided it was the end of something. the ground moved. Not much a brief low tremor, the kind that buildings registered as a groan of settling, and people registered as a sudden held breath. But it was directional. John could feel the direction of it through his boots, through the stones of the yard, coming from the north. He was close. In the weirwood network at Winterfell, Bran felt the approach in the oldest roots of the tree, the pressure of a very large thing, moving through the substrate toward the center of the continent's concentrated meaning. He had been watching for 2 days. He had known this convergence was coming since before any of them had arrived at it. King's Landing was not a city anymore. It was a question that had been building for 3,000 years, who held the center, who defined the law, whose bloodline carried the authority to tell other bloodlines what they were worth. Every war the continent had fought, every king who had sat the Iron Throne, every house that had risen and fallen, had been in some sense an argument about the answer to that question. The answer that was coming from the north was not a name or a bloodline or a dynasty. It was a principle, and the principle did not recognize the question as legitimate. The bells were silent. The harbor fires burned. The crowd sounds had changed register, less the noise of movement and more the noise of people who had stopped moving, because there was no longer a direction that felt different from any other. Jon stood in the outer yard of the Red Keep and looked north and waited. Somewhere behind him, Daenerys was on Drogon's back. Somewhere in the lower city, Jaime was at the river gate. Somewhere in the streets between Arya was moving with a Valyrian dagger and a piece of surface material and a half-second in a heartbeat that might or might not be enough. And somewhere above all of it, Bran was watching through roots that ran deeper than the foundations of the oldest building in this city, watching the thing that came toward the convergence of everything. The thing that had decided this world needed to be pressed until it showed what it was made of. The ground moved again. Longer this time. The cracks appeared in the outer approach road, long radiating the specific pattern that the stone carried when something very large and very determined was close enough to register in the earth itself. Jon drew Longclaw, not because he thought it would be enough, because he was still here and here required it. The city waited. The bells stayed silent. The cracks spread toward the gate. The smoke had not cleared by the time he arrived. It hung over King's Landing in layers, the gray-brown of burning timber, the black of pitch and tallow, the faint green edge near the lower harbor where something in the old district had caught that shouldn't have. The streets below the Red Keep were navigable only in the sense that they were not physically blocked. The cobblestones were covered in the accumulated debris of a city that had been slowly discarding its own weight for days. And the people who remained moved through it with the hollow blankness of those who had passed through the stage of fear into the stage on the far side of it. Jon moved through the outer approach with perhaps 200 people behind him. Fighters, mostly with a scattering of those who had refused to leave without their neighbors, who had refused to leave their neighbors without someone capable of putting a weapon between them and whatever came next. He had stopped counting. At some point, the number had become less important than the direction. The ground had been moving for an hour, not constantly in pulses, each one slightly closer than the last, the interval between them, narrowing in a way that had its own arithmetic. He felt the last pulse through the soles of his boots and stopped walking. Turned north. The gates of the Red Keep stood open. Beyond them, at the far end of the approach road, where the ground had been cracking since the previous morning, the air had taken on a quality that preceded him. The way cold preceded a storm, a pressure differential, a redistribution of the atmosphere's attention. Then he came through the gate. Apocalypse moved through the outer approach of the Red Keep at the rate of something that had decided the distance was irrelevant. Daenerys came off the upper battlements on Drogon's back before he had covered half of it. Viserion banking in from the east, both dragons low over the ruined rooflines of the capital. their combined shadows sweeping across the approach road in a darkness wider than either building. She had been waiting for this not with hope, but with the intention that whatever happened, she would be facing it rather than watching it. Dracarys. The flame hit the approach road in a sustained column. Viserion converged from the left. The convergence point was direct sustain, the two streams held without withdrawal. Daenerys pressing Drogon to maintain beyond the point where maintaining was comfortable. The figure walked through it. He emerged from the far edge of the flame with the armor's surface running its continuous cycle. The micro-adjustments, the seam intervals, the process that Arya had mapped in the throne room and Bran had interpreted at Winterfell. The flame had not stopped the cycle. It had not even interrupted it. He continued forward, and the approach road cracked beneath him in the long radiating lines that had been following him across Westeros since the coast. Jon moved to intercept. He did not think of it as intercept in the tactical sense. He was not positioned to stop something this large, and he had not stopped pretending otherwise since Winterfell. He moved forward because forward was the direction that meant something, and meaning was the last currency he had. Longclaw caught the light as he closed the distance. Around him, the 200 moved with him, not in formation, not in the organized assault patterns that combat doctrine prescribed, but in the organic clustering of people who had decided separately and simultaneously that this was the ground they were going to hold. The first exchange was what all the exchanges had been. Jon got inside the reach Longclaw, finding the left shoulder junction. At the half-second he had memorized from Arya's description, the contact producing the familiar deep force feedback through his arm that was not pain, so much as the body's honest report of what it had struck. Around him, the 200 made contact at every angle they could reach blades and polearms and improvised weapons, contributing a pressure that was in aggregate real, not decisive, not damaging, but real. A sustained engagement that occupied multiple input vectors simultaneously. Apocalypse paused. 1 second, perhaps 2. The pausing was not hesitation. Jon understood this, even in the middle of it. Even with the arm throbbing and the ground still cracking and the dragons overhead pressing their own angle into the engagement. The pause was recalibration. He was adjusting his assessment of what he was dealing with, adding the current data to the accumulated record of everything this continent had shown him. Then the arm came out, and the 200 stopped being 200. Not all of them. Half. Less than half. The ones at the outer edge had the most room to move and moved. The ones in the center had Jon's back and held the center until the center became untenable. And then held it anyway, because that was what the center did. Daenerys brought Drogon down, not to the approach road to the inner yard landing with the controlled violence of something very large, making a decision rather than an error. And she came off his back with the sword she had been carrying since Dragonstone and crossed the yard toward the engagement at a run. And the character of it was not heroic in the way the word hero implied, scale or celebration. It was simply the movement of a woman who had decided where she was going to be when the last argument ended. She reached Jon's position. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, not communication. Nothing that could be reduced to words, just the brief contact of two people who were doing the same thing for different reasons and had found, at the bottom of all the reasons, a shared floor. She pressed into the engagement from the east. He held the west. Between them, Arya moved. She had been in the upper yard since before the gate opened. The Valyrian dagger was in her hand, and the piece of surface material from the throne room was in the inside pocket of her vest, where she could feel it against her ribs, warm in the way it had been warm since she took it. She had been studying the approach from above, the lines of approach, the positions, the way the engagement was developing, the geometry of where the interval would be accessible and where it wouldn't. Bran's last message had been 3 words: left side. Low. She moved through the outer edge of the engagement below the sightline of most of the combatants, using the debris on the approach road as cover. The way she used furniture and column and shadow, the practiced economy of movement. That was not invisibility, but was the next best thing. The reduction of the self to a feature of the environment rather than an object in it. The left shoulder junction, the interval at the contraction point. The half-second when the two surfaces had not quite rejoined. She had done this once in the throne room under conditions she had controlled. The conditions now were not controlled. The conditions now were 2 dragons and the remnants of 200 fighters and a city that had been falling apart for a week and the raw, chaotic geometry of a large-scale engagement in an enclosed approach road. She waited for the right cycle. Watched 3 complete. Watched the 4th begin. In the contraction of the 4th cycle, when the seam in the left shoulder junction was at its widest point, which was not wide, which was a hair's breadth, which was what she crossed the last 10 feet. In the time it took the cycle to hold its breath and drove the dagger in, deeper than the throne room. Not 2 inches, 4. The resistance was the same category of wrong. Not flesh, not metal. The in-between material that was continuous and self-correcting, and now for the length of time it took her to pull the blade back out, interrupted. What came with the blade this time was larger than a palm-sized fragment. It was a section irregular, dense, the surface material pulling away from the underlying structure in a way that left a gap before the cycle resumed, and the gap sealed. The arm that came for her arrived faster than the first time. She was already under it. The arm hit the approach road where she had been, and the impact sent fragments of cobblestone in every direction and opened a crack in the road surface that ran 6 feet toward the gate, and Arya was rolling across the debris field and coming up on the far side with the dagger and the new fragment and a cut across her left forearm, where a cobblestone edge had caught her on the way over. She was alive. She pressed the fragment against the first one in her pocket and felt the warmth of both of them. The 2 pieces of evidence that the process had gaps, that the gaps were real, that a person could reach them if the person was willing to pay what reaching them cost. It was not enough. It had never been enough to end this. She had known that before she entered the Red Keep. She had known it before she came to King's Landing. The point was not enough. The point was real. The engagement continued for another 20 minutes. Jon held the western approach with whoever remained to hold it. Daenerys drove Drogon into repeated close passes that kept the engagement from becoming a one-directional advance. Viserion worked the upper angles, his fire sustaining the pressure that occupied the largest available input vectors. Jaime, somewhere in the lower city, held the river gate approach for a time, and then held the secondary approach for a time, and then held the ground between the secondary approach and the people still trying to get clear of the harbor district for as long as holding could mean anything. Tyrion stood on the upper terrace of the Red Keep and watched the approach road and did what he had always done, organized the information into the shape of its implications, identified the path that preserved the most of what was worth preserving, and communicated it to whoever could still receive it. The path at this point was south, away from the center, out through the harbor, if the ships had anything left, or simply south through the city and out the southern gate and into the open country, which was not safe but was not this. He sent 4 runners with that information, which was all he could do. Apocalypse moved through the engagement at the rate of something finishing an assessment. The fighters around him were not eliminated, so much as processed, evaluated against the standard, sorted by the evaluation. The ones who met the minimum threshold of not yet finished, allowed to continue not finishing, while the ones who didn't were not offered the same consideration. The threshold was not strength in the martial sense. Jon had understood this since Winterfell. The threshold was something closer to refusal. the precise register of continued engagement in the face of certain futility that had no rational basis and was therefore paradoxically the most honest evidence of what a living thing actually was underneath the calculation. The 200 had become 80. The 80 held. He stopped in the center of the approach road, not to rest, not because the resistance had managed to halt him. He stopped because he had arrived at the conclusion he had been forming since the coastal plain. And the conclusion required the acknowledgement of a fact that changed the remainder of the sequence. The world had not impressed him with its power. Nothing in Westeros had come close to matching his standard. But the world had marginally declined to be finished. The woman from White Harbor who had walked south instead of praying. The man who had stood in the crypt of his ancestors and not lowered his sword even when the sword accomplished nothing. The girl who had entered the darkness of the Red Keep twice to retrieve information that might allow the continuation of something. The queen who had flown her last 2 dragons into an engagement she had already lost once. Because the alternative was to leave the ground to something she refused to leave the ground to. These were not examples of strength. They were examples of refusal. The distinction was real, and it was in the context of what he had come to do more important than the strength. He looked at what remained of the engaged forces, the blood on the approach road, the fires still burning in the streets behind them, the 2 dragons circling overhead with the patience of things that had accepted an outcome without accepting a conclusion. He looked at Jon Snow, who was standing in the rubble of the eastern edge of the approach road with a sword that had run out of targets and a forearm wrapped around a wound he hadn't bothered to acknowledge yet. He looked at the Red Keep behind them, all the structure that had organized the political imagination of this continent for 3,000 years. The center that everything else had organized itself in relation to. The Iron Throne visible through the open gate, its 1,000 swords catching the red light of the burning city in the way that monuments caught light, when there was no one left to receive them. This world's map, he said, will not be given the mercy of a quick end. His voice in the open air of the ruined approach carried the weight it had always carried. Not loud, not performed, the simple resonance of something that had been speaking final things for longer than this civilization had existed. It will continue, and it will be pressed. And what survives the pressing will be what this place was always capable of producing if the pressing was sufficient. He looked at Jon directly, the pale gaze carrying the same systematic attention it had carried in the crypts in the marsh, in every engagement from the coast onward. You have demonstrated that the pressing is not finished, that determination has been made. The approach road was quiet except for the fires and the distant sound of the harbor. Jon said nothing. He had understood somewhere in the last 20 minutes that there was nothing left to say, that the engagement hadn't already said more honestly. Daenerys brought Drogon to the ground at the eastern edge of the yard and sat on his back in the silence of someone who had come to the end of the arguments and was now simply present in what the arguments had produced. The wound on Arya's arm had stopped bleeding. Tyrion on the upper terrace watched the approach road with the expression of a man performing the final audit of a very long account. Apocalypse turned from the gate. He walked north, through the approach road, through the outer gate, through the city's remaining streets, toward the northern approach. The cracks that his passage opened in the ground ran behind him and stayed open rather than closing, as though the earth had decided there was no point in pretending the surface was intact. He did not look back. Bran felt the departure through the roots. The pressure in the substrate had been enormous. For 3 days, a density in the weirwood network that registered as the presence of something that the network had not been designed to accommodate, and had accommodated anyway. The way very old structures accommodated extraordinary loads by becoming slowly something different from what they had been built to be. The pressure was easing. Not gone, redistributed the way a weight redistributed when the object bearing it shifted position rather than when the weight was removed. It was still here. It would always be here in the sense that its presence had altered the topology of the space it occupied, and that alteration did not undo itself when the presence moved. He looked at Winterfell through the window of the dim room, the yard, the towers, the dark sky above the north, where winter had been absolute for months, and had not become less absolute because the thing that had been moving through the world below it was gone from their immediate proximity. He thought about what Jon would come back to. Not a kingdom, not a restored order, not the world as it had been before the black stones rose from the coast and everything that followed from that moment. He would come back to ground. Contested, damaged, reduced ground. Westeros was still here. That was not the same as Westeros surviving. Surviving implied return to a prior state. What was here now was something that had been pressed almost past recognition and had not quite ceased to exist. The distinction between those two outcomes, the one that had almost happened and the one that had, was the width of a refusal. Not a grand one, not a mythic one. The plain repeated unremarkable refusal of certain people to stop being people when stopping would have been easier. He had watched it happen. He had understood its significance in real time, which was rare and cold in the way that real-time understanding of catastrophic things was always cold. Outside, the winter pressed on. Westeros would not be rebuilt into what it had been. The old names, the old thrones, the old arguments about bloodlines and succession, and the right of one house to order all the others. These were the products of a world that had operated under conditions that no longer held, and those conditions had changed. The center had been occupied by something that did not recognize their claims. The claims, as a result, had not survived. What survived was the capacity for the claims to be replaced by something else. What that something else would be was in the strictest sense not yet determined. It would be determined by whoever remained standing long enough to determine it under pressure sufficient to ensure that what they determined was genuine rather than inherited. That was not a happy ending. It was the only ending the world had earned. Bran looked at the southern horizon, where the light from King's Landing's remaining fires was fading toward the gray of winter dawn. The pressed world endured. The pressing was not finished. And somewhere north of the neck, on a road that led in a direction this continent had not yet had to name, something very large and very certain of its principles was moving. And the earth was recording each step in the only language it had left, and the record would not close.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.